The story began at Valjeer Academy, during the graduation ceremony held in the Academy's grand marble hall under a pristine sky. Among the names called that day was Michael Foxon, a standout graduate. As he stepped onto the podium, he greeted the audience with calm confidence, introducing himself as a proud second-year graduate of Valjeer Academy. In the distance, reclined on a thick branch, a young man watched him with a mocking smile. He remembered a time when Michael could barely string together a greeting without stuttering. His gaze lingered on Michael's white hair, which he mentally compared to a drifting puff of cotton. From his perch, he listened as Michael continued, voicing heartfelt gratitude for the 3 transformative years he had spent at the Academy. Michael stated that those years had been the most important of his life. The observer, Chris, smiled faintly, lost in his own memories. He reflected on how taxing it had been to stay in the shadows, playing the part of a background character. But with his main mission now behind him, he believed he could finally settle into a quiet, ordinary life. That belief shattered the moment Michael mentioned his name. He proclaimed that he owed everything to his mentor and guide, Chris. The words stunned Chris. Michael turned his gaze skyward, offering thanks and saying he wouldn't be who he was without Chris's unwavering support. Chris remained frozen, confusion growing. Michael didn't stop. He thanked Chris for never giving up on him, even during his weakest moments, and for always standing by him. Then, with resolute sincerity, Michael asked for a chance to return the favor. He declared that he would stay by Chris's side for the rest of his life, a pledge that left Chris speechless. The crowd reacted with loud protest. Chris suddenly realized that many explorers had been eyeing Michael for recruitment, drawn by his remarkable abilities. As the commotion grew, several other graduates, former students of Chris, rose from their seats. They announced their intentions to follow Michael's lead. They shared their desire to accompany their former teacher, Chris Dutton. One by one, 5 students pledged themselves to him, leaving Chris overwhelmed, unable to grasp what was unfolding. He began to question the situation, wondering how he had landed in such a bizarre role. Panic gripped him, and internally he screamed that he was nothing more than a forgotten side character. He feared he had derailed the story entirely. Memories from before his teaching days at Valjeer Academy flooded back, specifically, a brutal car crash from his past life. Lying on the pavement, blood pooling beneath him, he had seen a strange message appear before his fading eyes. It had labeled itself a main mission. A new life for something. It had asked if he wished to accept. Chris had felt a surge of fear, wondering if death had finally come for him. But then the word live appeared, urging him to choose. With desperation and resolve, Chris decided he didn't want to die, not there, not then. Clinging to the urge to live, he reached out and accepted the mission. The instant he made that choice, he awoke in a strange new place. A woman in formal attire welcomed him, remarking that he had finally regained consciousness. Chris noticed that she couldn't see the same floating message he did and was shocked when she addressed him by a new name. She handed him an identification card labeled Chris Dutton, informing him that he was the newest faculty member at Valjeer Academy. Despite the foreign symbols, he found himself able to read it clearly. She explained that his first day had technically already passed. The welcoming ceremony was over, delayed due to a train accident he had been involved in. She reassured him that the Academy would understand his absence. Panic seized him. He demanded a mirror, needing to see his new face. As he looked into it, another message appeared, stating that he had been reincarnated as a teacher at Valjeer Academy, and his main mission would span 3 years. Chris suddenly remembered Valjeer Academy was the setting of a fantasy novel he used to read casually. The plot had centered on a weak protagonist who gained godlike power and changed the world. Chris scoffed, thinking about the absurdity of his new reality. But details of the story eluded him, and he couldn't recall who exactly Chris Dutton had been. Another message appeared, warning that a teacher must have students, and that he had just 24 hours to report to the Academy's main gate. The penalty for failure: death. Terror struck him. He began to scream, paralyzed by the threat of dying once more. The nearby staff member looked at him with deep concern, believing he'd gone mad. Discharged early from the clinic, Chris winced from the lingering pain. As he wandered the city, he grumbled about being nearly broke. The clinic had drained half his funds. He recalled the nurse coldly demanding an outrageous sum for treatment. Now, he realized the local currency was gold, and the Academy was a half-day's walk away. Still disoriented, he wondered who exactly Chris Dutton was supposed to be. On instinct, he attempted to open a personal status window. It materialized, revealing stats that were both ridiculous and depressing. He was marked as a reclusive mage with passable magical power, the agility of a snail, and defense weaker than paper. Then came the real blow. A red warning. Illegal player. No magical skills permitted. Chris stared in disbelief. All those stats were worthless if he couldn't cast a single spell. He shouted at himself in bitter humor, asking if he'd been reborn into a pirated version of the world. Passers-by gave him odd looks. His anxiety only worsened. He remembered that in this world, only monsters lacked the ability to use magic. Fear crawled through him. If anyone discovered his condition, he could be branded a monster and executed. He imagined pleading for his life before a furious crowd. Then he noticed the countdown still ticking away. It pushed him into motion. He told himself there was no time for panic. He reminded himself he'd been given another chance. There was some luck in this. He had the cover story of a reclusive mage and experience from playing similar roles in online games. Recalling his gaming days, he clung to the praise he'd once earned for his role-playing skills. He resolved to fake it, to act like a mysterious powerhouse, hiding his flaws behind a mask of strength. At last, he reached the academy. A stone statue near the gate spoke, annoyed that the ceremony had ended a week prior and no one remained. But then it sensed a powerful presence approaching. The statue's awareness sharpened. It felt something beyond normal. The source was Chris Dutton. The statue registered the man's stark black hair, wild like a beast's mane, and his pale skin, almost glowing under the moonlight. His eyes were dark as night, and they burned with unspeakable emptiness. The aura he carried made the statue think of death in human form. Chris walked up, glared at the statue, and remarked coldly that a rock like it had no business guarding such a place. The statue snapped that he should identify himself and explain his purpose. Chris responded with authority, announcing that he was Chris Dutton, the new teacher, and ordered the gate to open. As he passed through, the pain and exhaustion overtook him. Out of sight, he collapsed, admitting how dire things truly were. Still, a flicker of relief came. He'd made it in time. He was alive. He began to think that this character he was pretending to be wasn't half bad. He decided to give this persona a name. The overpowered teacher with zero motivation. A man who looked lazy but wielded the strength of a battle-hardened warrior. The kind of character who could offer life-changing advice to the story's real hero. He recalled the backstory. This man had lost someone dear because of a mistake. It had broken him until the headmaster of Vulgir Academy offered him salvation. Chris realized that the most vital element of this persona was the trauma, and the refusal to accept students. He mused about how the character would treat new recruits, dismissing them arrogantly, claiming they were unworthy of his teachings. Chris thought the plan fit perfectly. He'd make his students believe they had to become stronger if they ever wanted to witness his magic. That illusion of distance and superiority would give him the cover he needed. But before he could savor the brilliance of the idea, he noticed blood smeared across his hand. Alarm flooded his mind as dizziness and intense pain followed. The wound from the train accident had reopened. As if mocking him, a message window popped up, notifying him that he'd received the academy map as a reward. Rage surged within him. He didn't need a map. He needed healing. In his current state, even reaching the infirmary felt impossible. Helpless and trembling, Chris stood frozen when a student approached, concern etched across his face. The student asked if he was all right, pointing out the blood dripping from Chris's forehead. Chris's gaze locked on the strange symbol etched faintly across the student's cheek, and realization struck him. This wasn't just anyone. This was Michael Foxon, the original protagonist of the novel. Michael hadn't awakened his cursed power yet. His hair was still brown, and his presence was anything but commanding. He just looked like a scared, awkward student. Chris decided this was the moment to solidify his role. He'd play the cold, detached teacher who didn't concern himself with the weak. He questioned Michael harshly, demanding to know why he was loitering outside during lesson time. Michael responded nervously, explaining that he'd fallen behind in class and had been banned from the training grounds by his former teacher. Chris studied him, now understanding Michael's low status among the other students. He could barely manage a basic fireball. Still, Chris felt a twinge of irritation at how the boy had been treated. It wasn't right, but he couldn't show sympathy now. Michael unexpectedly apologized, his voice trembling and his eyes moistening. Chris hadn't even aimed his coldness at him directly, yet the boy looked ready to cry. Feeling awkward, Chris impatiently asked what class Michael belonged to. He needed to return him quickly. Things were starting to spiral. Then came another twist. A mission window materialized in front of Chris, blunt and merciless. He had less than 10 minutes to reach his classroom and begin his first lesson as the homeroom teacher of Class 10. Failure meant death. Despite the map now in his possession, Chris couldn't make heads or tails of the layout. Based on the context, he assumed Michael had to be from Class 10. Michael confirmed it nervously, saying he was a member of that very class. Chris ordered him sharply to lead the way. Michael hesitated but complied, his fear evident in every step. Chris eventually had to carry Michael most of the way. By the time they reached the classroom, Chris was barely holding himself together. Exhaustion screamed through every fiber of his body, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. Michael, on the other hand, collapsed immediately upon arrival, groaning in fatigue. His classmates jeered, mocking his dramatic entrance and telling him to sit down and stop causing a scene. Then Chris entered. The students stared, stunned by his appearance. Blood still streaked his face, and his dark aura filled the room like a thundercloud. Chris scanned the classroom with an expression of disdain. He declared that all of them were trash and openly criticized the headmaster, Valjeer, for the subpar quality of students he had been given. Whispers filled the room. Confusion and discomfort spread. One student, Nika Toot, raised his hand with smug confidence. As the top student in the class, he demanded to know who Chris was and questioned if he even had permission to be there. Chris responded smoothly, stating that his name was Chris Dutton. Recognition dawned on Nika's face. He remembered the rumors about the new teacher who'd been injured in a train accident. Before Nika could say more, Chris cut him off with a cold command to be silent. Internally, Chris cringed. His entrance had been an utter disaster. He just hoped it wouldn't be held against him. Realizing he had no choice, Chris knew the lesson had to start. He didn't have the luxury of pre-written scripts or insider knowledge like most reincarnated protagonists. Still, he moved forward. With no better option, he grabbed a piece of chalk and made a bold decision. He wrote one word on the board: self-study. The students were stunned. Their expressions shifted from disbelief to bewilderment. Chris had just started their first class with a self-study session. He could feel his face burning in embarrassment, but he kept his posture straight, leaning into the absurdity of the role he was playing. Then he pushed it further. He pretended to fall asleep right there, as if teaching them wasn't even worth the effort. The class sat in shocked silence. Chris, meanwhile, felt an odd satisfaction at his performance. He wondered, half-jokingly, if this even counted as a lesson. But his moment of triumph was shattered. A sharp voice rang through the room, scolding him for his ridiculous behavior. Panic surged in Chris's chest. The voice belonged to a girl, one he instantly recognized. Angelina Sharif stood tall, furious. She berated Chris for missing the opening ceremony and tarnishing the Academy's reputation. Chris knew who she was. The Ice Princess. A duke's daughter. A potential heroine candidate. She was elegant, powerful, and proud, and she declared her complete rejection of everything Chris represented. The other students, most of them nobles, began murmuring in agreement. Chris knew this could cause long-term problems, but he had already chosen his mask, and he wouldn't drop it now. He told Angelina coldly that if she didn't like being in his class, she could leave. She froze, stunned by his bluntness. Chris repeated himself, this time with even more anger. He warned her not to make him say it a third time. The room fell into a tense silence. Angelina's face flushed with fury. She responded bitterly that she had no intention of learning from someone like him. She said he wasn't even capable of keeping up with proper lessons and declared that she wouldn't waste her time on a worthless teacher. With that, Angelina stormed out. The classroom filled with whispers, surprised, nervous, and uncertain. Chris remained still, maintaining the cold expression on his face, even as uncertainty stirred beneath the surface. At that moment, Chris admitted to himself that this reaction was entirely expected. Most of the students were high-born nobles, raised on pride and entitlement, and he wondered how many would remain loyal to a teacher like him. Anxiety crept in as he considered the consequences of his harsh performance. He feared losing his job before it had even properly begun and silently placed his hopes on the academy headmaster to back him up when the backlash inevitably arrived. Just then, a new message window flashed before his eyes, informing him that he had successfully completed the mission. The rewards included an academy map and something called a monkey medal. The unexpected success brought a wave of relief. He scanned the classroom and noticed that nearly half the students had already walked out. The ones still seated were key characters: Michael, the protagonist, along with the top-ranking students and potential heroines. Chris quickly identified them: Dulcie, the sharp-eyed redhead with a fiery presence; Belle, the quiet girl known for her healing abilities. He made a mental note to delay introducing the last key member of the cast, who hadn't appeared yet. Now was the time to play the role of the wise mentor. Standing straight, he addressed the remaining students with a voice filled with confidence and grit. He warned them that learning magic with anything less than complete dedication was a direct path to death. He declared that Valgir Academy was not a school. It was a killer's forge. His words hit like a whip. Shock spread across the room. The students were left stunned, their wide eyes betraying both fear and confusion. Chris pressed forward, explaining that the so-called accidents involving students were no accidents at all. They were cover stories for those who had mishandled the power they wielded. He asked them plainly if they were truly ready to bear the consequences of failure, of magic unchecked. Silence fell over the class, deep and complete. No one dared to speak. Satisfied, Chris turned on his heel and exited the room. Outside the building, laughter burst out of him. Loud, uninhibited relief. It felt like a decade of his life had just been carved out from the sheer pressure of staying in character. He knew he had to adapt, and quickly. This world was no dream. His thoughts turned to the monkey medal, the quirky little item he'd earned. He pulled out the keychain and examined it. It was monkey-shaped, absurdly cute, and oddly impressive. He couldn't deny liking it, but he hesitated to put it on, afraid it might ruin the intimidating persona he was crafting. A message popped up asking for confirmation. Equipping the keychain would lock it in place for 5 minutes. Chris hesitated, then decided to see what it could do. As soon as he confirmed, another window appeared, informing him that his agility stat had increased from F to E. He exclaimed to himself that it was practically a cheat item. Chris quickly tucked the keychain under his shirt, relieved it wouldn't mess with his image. He was happy to gain a boost, especially one that might help him avoid a sword to the face. But before he could celebrate too long, a new notification arrived, with a strange caveat. It stated that every sentence he spoke would now automatically end with the word, Kai. Chris froze. Confused, he began muttering to himself and, to his horror, the bizarre suffix tagged itself to everything he said. Panic hit like a brick. He shouted in disbelief, asking if the game was implying he was a monkey, and raged that someone like him should never be cursed with this kind of speech. In the middle of his rant, a voice called to him. It was Angelina. She appeared behind him, surprised by the scene, and asked hesitantly if he was Professor Chris. He turned slowly, his expression composed, and asked why she was there. Angelina inwardly cursed herself for not casting a concealment spell. She had been caught while sneaking off to smoke a cigarette. Chris's piercing gaze froze her in place. She knew instantly that this was someone who didn't make exceptions, not even for nobles. Not even for the Sharif name. Chris instantly recalled what kind of character Angelina was. A cold, genius noble who placed all trust in her own strength and refused to rely on anyone. Angelina, in turn, found that his gaze struck deeper than she expected. It reminded her of painful memories, and it weakened her resolve. Chris approached her in silence, and his quiet advance made her nervous. She wondered if he was about to search her or prevent her escape. Unable to bear the pressure, Angelina confessed on the spot that she had been smoking and said she would accept whatever punishment he deemed appropriate. Inwardly, she hoped that Chris would declare her unfit to carry responsibility, that he would be the one to finally reject her, freeing her from the impossible burdens she carried as a noble heir. But instead, Chris did something entirely unexpected. He gently touched her forehead and, thanks to the keychain, called her a pitiful little girl, ending his sentence with, Kai. Angelina was confused and asked what he meant by that. In that moment, Chris felt a wave of empathy for her. He recognized the familiar mask she wore, rebellious actions to hide deeper pain. He remembered someone he had once failed, someone he had held in grief and guilt, and reminded himself that no power could erase the past. Angelina, stunned by the tenderness of his words, felt something shift. It wasn't pity that touched her, but understanding. Then she noticed the monkey keychain peeking from under Chris's shirt. She concluded that he must have received it from someone important. She apologized to him silently for stirring painful memories, for behaving like a foolish child. Chris, meanwhile, wondered nervously if she had noticed the "kai" tick in his speech. Angelina returned to the classroom, leaving Chris to his thoughts. Inside, Belle asked her where she'd gone, but Angelina simply replied that she had been thinking about Professor Chris. Back in the classroom, Nika Toot was visibly excited. He declared that with only 5 students left, himself, Michael, Dulcie, Belle, and Angelina, Class 10 was now an elite unit. Dulcie, with her usual sass, remarked that the others had run off like cowards and said she wanted to show them what real strength looked like. Her teasing clearly targeted Michael, whose red cheeks betrayed his embarrassment. Chris noted this dynamic with dry amusement, mentally dubbing Dulcie the mischievous type of heroine. Belle intervened, lightly scolding Dulcie and reminding Michael to focus. She turned to Chris and politely asked what the lesson plan was for the day. Chris paused, then realized he couldn't stall anymore. He told them, with a serious tone, that today's class would be a field training session. A message suddenly popped up, outlining a new mission. Class 10 had to travel to Vanet's Plains and defeat 50 monsters within 24 hours. The classroom faded from view as a massive magic circle ignited beneath their feet. The light engulfed them all. In a flash, the scenery shifted. They stood in the vast beauty of Vanet's Plains. The students stared in awe at the sudden teleportation, marveling at the magic. Nika burst into praise, saying Chris had mastered spatial magic even before they had received their official weapons. But Chris stood stiff, confused. The teleportation hadn't been his doing, and he had no idea who had activated it. Just moments earlier, they had been inside the classroom. Now they stood under the open sky of the Vanet's Plains, the sudden shift in scenery leaving the students disoriented. Dulcie, ever observant, pointed out a strange shadow flickering above Professor Chris's head. She asked how such an advanced magical transport could have happened, especially since no one among them had the ability to cast it. Chris immediately sensed something was wrong. This hadn't been part of the mission briefing. The teleportation hadn't come from him. It had been triggered by someone or something else. As the realization struck, a cold shiver crawled down his spine. That's when it appeared. A horned rabbit, towering, monstrous, and completely unnatural, emerged with a terrifying roar. A system notification confirmed Chris's fear. They had been summoned here by an unidentified third party. Dulcie and Angelina cried out, warning Chris of the monster looming right behind him. Terror clenched Chris's chest. For a split second, he wondered if this was the end, if he was truly going to die here, overwhelmed before even starting. There were still 50 monsters to defeat, and now this monstrous creature was practically breathing down his neck. But Chris steadied himself. He reminded himself that he wasn't just Chris, panicked newcomer to a fantasy world. He was playing the role of Chris Dutton, powerful, composed, and dangerous. He asked himself what that version of him would do, and the answer came instantly. Chris Dutton would treat this as a training opportunity, nothing more. A test. A sharpening stone for his students' resolve. With that, he barked a commanding question to the students, asking if they had forgotten why they came here. His voice snapped them into motion. Angelina responded with disbelief, saying it was reckless to treat this scenario like a drill. But Nika, always the eager achiever, stepped in and interpreted Chris's behavior as brilliance. He confidently declared that, naturally, Professor Chris would handle the giant monster on his own, and the students only needed to take care of the smaller enemies. Chris felt an enormous weight lift off his shoulders. Nika had unknowingly covered for him. Angelina, still skeptical but unwilling to show hesitation, put her trust in Chris's supposed plan. She began casting a high-tier spell, channeling her ice spear with sharp precision before charging at the encroaching monsters. Belle quickly claimed the role of support, assuring everyone she'd heal the wounded. Michael, despite his trembling hands, focused on building up his magical energy. He whispered to himself that he had to succeed, just once. Together, the group pushed back. Blow by blow, spell after spell, they managed to defeat all 50 of the smaller monsters. Chris watched them with genuine admiration. He quietly acknowledged that this was exactly what he expected from story protagonists and their destined companions. Then he turned back, and there it was. The horned rabbit still stood, its massive frame casting a shadow across the battlefield, eyes gleaming with primal hunger. Chris's blood went cold. He stood face to face with it, smiling nervously even as panic roared inside his chest. He thought, almost comically, that passing out before the pain hit might have been the better route. But he shook that thought off. There was no giving up. If he failed here, death would come for real. And if he had to die, then it would be after putting up a damn good fight. Meanwhile, Michael was still locked in battle with the smaller creatures. Then he turned, and saw Chris alone, facing the giant beast. His heart dropped. A scream tore from his throat as he realized that Chris was in real danger. He ran toward him, shouting that the situation was impossible. His mind spiraled into memories, loss, failure, guilt. Michael believed that once again, someone was dying because of him. Tears streamed down his face as he blamed himself for being too weak to save anyone. He reached out, asking aloud if this was truly his fault. Belle tried to stop him, warning that getting closer was suicide, but Michael shouted that the teacher was still alive. Belle's voice softened with sorrow as she said it was already too late. She added that Chris had likely sacrificed himself to save them, that the monster was full now and slowing down. Michael refused to accept it. He clutched Belle's arms desperately, insisting she could heal Chris. But Belle could only apologize. Her magic couldn't undo death. The world blurred as Michael broke down, memories consuming him. He remembered a moment with Chris, not long ago, when he had asked the teacher to help him grow stronger. He had admitted he had no right to ask, but begged anyway, saying he wanted the strength to take responsibility and stop running away. Chris had looked at him with calm conviction and told him that he would become strong. In that moment, Michael had felt hope. Chris was the only one who had ever truly believed in him. Now, Dulcie's voice rang across the battlefield, fierce and determined. She shouted for the others not to give up and to keep fighting. Nika responded immediately, unleashing a powerful offensive spell to rally the group. But Michael remained frozen. He still believed he was the weak link, the one who should have been eaten instead. Belle pleaded with him to flee, but he stayed put, sobbing, wishing death upon himself if it meant saving the others. And then it came. A voice. Cold, eerie, and strangely gentle. It whispered to Michael that if he truly desired strength, he had to take its hand and surrender to it completely. The voice promised power, but at a price. Michael faltered. His grief began to give way, but then, something shifted. A sudden change. A flash of light. A voice cut through the chaos, ordering everyone to stop immediately. Chris stood tall, alive and unbroken. The monster was dead. Chris's clothes were torn, his face bruised, but he radiated authority as he sarcastically asked why his students were trying to flee when there were still monsters left to kill. Shock swept across the field. The impossible had happened. Chris had survived. At that moment, a new message window appeared in front of him. It confirmed that 27 out of 50 monsters had been defeated. The mission was far from over, but their greatest obstacle had already been crushed. The path forward was beginning to clear. One student shouted in disbelief, asking if Professor Chris had allowed himself to be eaten on purpose just to strike the monster from the inside. Chris didn't clarify, but he silently thanked the student for giving the perfect excuse and ran with it. He scolded the class for making noise and losing focus, reminding them sharply that today was their field training. He chastised them for forgetting their mission and attempting to flee at the first sign of chaos. Another student, Nira, called out, warning that it was too dangerous to return to the battlefield now. The red-headed Dulcie, brimming with confidence, announced that her eyes wouldn't miss a single detail. She added playfully that even if the others had been fooled, she would figure out whatever Chris was hiding. Her tone was light, but the threat behind her words sent an involuntary shiver down Chris's spine. She frightened him more than most monsters did. Looking around, Chris noticed that several students were in tears, because of him. Guilt tried to claw its way to the surface, especially when his gaze landed on Michael, the protagonist. He questioned what kind of main character Michael was supposed to be, considering his powers were still dormant. Chris felt a pang of responsibility but quickly buried it under his usual cold facade. Angelina stepped forward, demanding answers. She asked if it had really been necessary to go that far. She explained that after seeing him get eaten, the students kept fighting, thinking it was a test. She accused him of recklessly risking everything for what she called a dangerous performance, criticizing him for not ending the battle instantly. Chris considered whether to explain the truth, that the monster had exploded from within because his overwhelming magical energy had been too much to digest. Monsters were drawn to magic, and Chris's presence was like gourmet bait. But instead of sharing that detail, he responded icily that anyone unhappy with his methods was free to leave. Michael stepped in, voice shaking with remorse. He apologized repeatedly, vowing never to repeat the same mistake. He begged Chris not to abandon him. Chris felt that same guilt rise again, but he kept his expression stern. Chris then explained to the class that in this world, magic power determined survival. He told them that monsters were born with minimal magic and needed to absorb it from others to grow stronger. He revealed that his own magical output was so high that to monsters, he was like premium foie gras topped with caviar. Irresistible. He likened it to trying to stuff a watermelon into a tiny sack. The monster simply couldn't take it. As he surveyed the battlefield, Chris realized that with the boss monster down, the smaller enemies would now rush them. But he was impressed to see his students already fighting in flawless coordination. He admitted inwardly that they seemed in perfect sync, even without his instruction. At the very least, he thought, he should be able to protect himself. He equipped the monkey keychain again, knowing it would boost his agility. The upgrade raised his rank from F, what he called snail, to E, or big bro snail. It wasn't spectacular, but it might help him dodge something lethal. Just as he adjusted the keychain, a monster lunged at him. He ducked back just in time, barely dodging the deadly strike. Michael cried out, asking if the professor was all right, then fired off a blast to take down the attacker. Chris exhaled sharply, thinking that if he were still F rank in agility, he'd be missing half his cheek right now. He told himself that he wasn't completely helpless, not yet. Dulcie looked over and mocked him, asking if he was really okay, then apologized with a smirk, claiming she must have let one slip by. Another student echoed the apology and promised to train harder. Chris shrugged it off, watching as the students regrouped and prepared to push forward with the mission. Their morale was battered, but their determination had hardened. Then, the atmosphere shifted. A mysterious figure appeared atop a dragon, observing them with an unsettling calm. He exclaimed that he had considered the possibility, but now that he'd seen it for himself, it really was Chris. Chris narrowed his eyes and muttered under his breath, confused. He didn't recognize the man, but everything about his entrance screamed, mastermind. Then a more alarming thought struck him. Was this the one who had teleported them to the plains? The figure, blindfolded and wrapped in bandages, stepped down and addressed Chris with a chilling familiarity. He said that he had waited a long time to see him. Chris, still silent, wondered why the man had removed his hood so casually if he was trying to hide his identity. He speculated on their connection and noted with unease that the man was staring at him with an intensity that felt emotional. Chris thought that his expression resembled the gaze of a love-struck maiden, and the realization made him cringe. Noticing the strange glances his students were casting him, Chris grimaced. He told them silently that they were completely wrong. He had no idea who this guy was. The man asked if Chris wasn't happy to see him. He then added, with a teasing smile, that if Chris was still upset about the past, he was sorry. Chris didn't respond, his expression unreadable, but inside he was spiraling. He had no memories of what the previous Chris had been through. Still, he told himself that he had to keep playing the role, no matter what. Michael called out, but when the students caught sight of Chris's eyes, they froze. The look in them was colder and more cautious than they had ever seen. One whispered that this man must be incredibly dangerous, for Professor Chris to appear that guarded. Chris observed the stranger more carefully. The man was controlling monsters like they were pets. That could only mean one thing. He was likely the one who had summoned the horned rabbit in the first place. The figure sighed dramatically, lamenting that he had thought someone had killed his precious darlings, only to find out it was Chris. Michael trembled as he admitted that without Chris's intervention, he wouldn't have survived. The man continued, explaining that his master had merely wanted to check on the young master's progress. He admitted he had planned to kill one of Michael's friends in front of him, just to test him, but hadn't anticipated Chris showing up. He then asked Chris to see it from his side too. The hooded figure stepped closer and placed his hands on Chris's shoulders. The students tensed, ready to strike. but Chris raised a hand to signal them to stand down. Still silent, Chris listened as the man asked why he hadn't said anything. He remarked that making excuses didn't suit Chris. Michael watched with growing dread. He could see Chris's killer expression, but noticed that he wasn't retaliating. Michael wondered if it was because of them, if Chris was holding back for their sake. The thought frustrated him. He hated being a burden. He admitted silently that at his current level, he could only fight monsters already on the brink of death. The man told Chris that since they were both just following orders, he wouldn't interfere further. Then, with a softened tone, he added that a simple, "good job," from Chris would lift his spirits. Michael observed him with narrowed eyes. He thought that the man seemed to care for Chris, but the tone of his affection was twisted. This wasn't friendship. It was selfish obsession dressed as devotion. The figure offered to help Chris if things were too difficult, reminding him that he had always said his face was beautiful. Then, with no warning, Chris struck. In a single flash, the hooded figure was caught off guard. Michael was tense. Chris had suddenly drawn a sword and placed it against the neck of the stranger, and Michael was still trying to process what just happened. His mind raced. Where had that sword even come from? Creation magic was rare, nearly impossible. Only a handful of people across the continent could wield it. But then again, if anyone could, it would be Professor Chris. Chris asked the stranger what kind of nonsense he had been spouting all this time. He told him to go talk in his sleep, calling him trash. The stranger tensed but responded that Chris was still holding a grudge over that, wasn't he? Chris smiled on the outside, but internally, he was shaken. He thought to himself that he had been saved thanks to the protagonist defeating the 50th monster. He had wished for it so badly, prayed in his heart that at least one of the fallen enemies would be taken out. A short while before, Michael had felt disheartened. He wasn't on the same level as Chris or that stranger. That fact stung. But despite that, he'd done what he could. He'd killed a monster. And that single act completed Chris's task from the system: defeat 50 monsters. As the task cleared, the system notified Chris of his reward. He had obtained the map of Vidal Academy, 3/4, and an ancient sword. The system instructed him to remove the monkey keyholder and equip the rusty sword instead. Chris, without hesitation, asked the system to do it immediately. The rusty, ancient sword materialized in his grip. That's why it was in his hand now, pressed against the stranger's throat. The system explained that the sword could cut through most materials and had 3/3 usable durability. Chris thanked Michael aloud and, silently, he thought that it was thanks to him that he managed to preserve both his life and his dignity. He acknowledged to himself, Michael had done well. The stranger commented that Chris didn't seem in the mood to talk today and said he'd come back another time. He added that if Chris ever needed help, he could be reached through the master. But Chris responded sharply. He told the stranger that if he didn't want his mouth torn open, he should vanish immediately. Internally, he was relieved that the stranger left without further drama. Once the stranger was gone, Chris and Michael turned their attention to the students. The fear was obvious on their faces. Dolce remarked that she had barely been able to breathe and had run out of mana. Michael asked if she was okay. Chris didn't reply. Instead, he instructed Angelina to send word to the academy. They needed a carriage to return. Angelina responded that she understood and added that it would have been better if they'd called for reinforcements earlier. Dolce commented that if their teacher had used spatial magic, everything could have been wrapped up in an instant. Chris didn't answer that either. Michael interjected, suggesting that Professor Chris was just tired and probably needed some time to think things through. Hearing that, tears welled up in Chris's eyes. He thought that he was truly glad Michael had been there today. Eventually, all members of Class 10 returned safely. The next day, Chris carried on with his usual routine, but his mind was still heavy. He thought that things were getting off to a rough start. He reflected on the life he had lived up to now and considered the man with bandages. That man was likely the character Maria. Not many had the ability to create chimeras or control monsters. And in the original story, Maria had never even been visually described. Being followed by someone so blatantly suspicious could only spell trouble. And Chris's instincts proved correct. A man stood in front of him now, causing a flicker of confusion in Chris. That man was Eugene. the homeroom teacher of Class Y, he greeted Chris and noted that he hadn't seen him in the cafeteria yet. He asked if Chris had eaten. Chris looked at Eugene and thought, of course, him too. The events of the field training had been so regular that the principal had summoned Class 10 immediately upon their return. But instead of disciplinary action or interrogation, the principal chose to reinforce the academy's defensive magic circle and imposed a gag order on the entire incident. On top of that, someone was assigned to monitor Chris. That someone was the narrow-eyed Eugene. Chris figured the principal had pieced it together, that the person who approached him had ties to the Demon Lord's army. Since there was a chance Chris might be colluding with them, the principal had appointed Eugene to keep an eye on him. Over 10 years ago, the Demon King had been defeated by the Holy Emperor and was believed to be long gone. But just like every fantasy cliché, he had only gone underground, working from the shadows to make a return. The story's protagonist was supposed to rise, hold himself back, and then take revenge. That was the premise of the strongest Demon King hero tale. And now Chris was caught in the middle, trapped between the Holy Emperor's faction and the Demon Lord's army. If Eugene caught on to anything, Chris knew he'd be in deep trouble. Eugene asked again if Chris wanted to have lunch together. Chris told him he was noisy and annoying, and that he should just disappear. Eugene replied with a calm tone, asking if his voice had been too loud. He then offered to lower it and added that many people told him he had a nice voice. Seeing Eugene act so bizarrely, Chris felt a surge of anger building inside. He clenched his fists but kept his cool. Inwardly, he questioned whether this guy was some kind of pervert too. He wondered bitterly if everyone around him had a screw loose. Then, keeping his tone sharp, he told Eugene to shut his mouth. Eugene only laughed in response. He said that shutting his mouth would be difficult, unless, of course, Chris wanted to cover it with his own hands. Chris shot back with a harsh reply, telling him to shove his own fist in his mouth. Just then, a new system quest popped up in Chris's mind. Wish of the Earth God 1-4. Building relationships with fellow teachers is also important. Try inviting a fellow teacher to hold a joint class. The rewards were listed. The map of Vidal Academy for the 4th S, and a rotten mandragora root. But then came the kicker. Failure means death. The countdown started. 48 hours. Chris thought to himself that they weren't even pretending to hide the malice anymore. Do it or die had basically become the system's default setting. Left with no choice, he figured he'd have to use Eugene somehow. Eugene was, after all, the homeroom teacher of Class Y. The class that absorbed the most transfer students from Class 10. Still, he wondered how to propose something like a joint class without breaking character. He wasn't the friendly type. Certainly not a tsundere. Then it clicked. The quest only required the joint class. It didn't say they had to become friends. With that in mind, Chris addressed Eugene seriously. He said that because of him, he had wasted 5 minutes of his life. He added that while he would love to make him pay for that right now, he hoped his master would learn to love more things. And if that happened, that child would end up sad. Even as he said it, Chris cringed inside. He admitted to himself that even though he made this backstory, it was unbearably embarrassing. He pushed through and continued. He said that if Eugene was that desperate to get close to him, then they should have a match. His words were clear. The trash that Eugene was teaching versus the scum he had raised. They would see who was better. As he said it, Chris thought to himself that Eugene wouldn't refuse. He was under orders from the principal to get close and extract useful information. Eugene asked if Chris meant a match between their students. Chris confirmed, saying that if he won, Eugene should never show his face again. Eugene took a moment, then agreed. With a smile, he added that Chris had surprisingly fun ideas. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said that if he won, Chris would have to treat him to a meal. Chris, confused, wondered why Eugene was so obsessed with food. It didn't make sense. But out loud, he replied that there was no chance he would lose. Eugene agreed, saying it all sounded like fun. Then he asked when they should do it. Chris said the match would be held tomorrow afternoon. Eugene acknowledged the time and told him he'd see him then. As Chris turned away and walked off, he thought that the result didn't really matter. The only thing that counted was completing the quest by holding a joint class. But truthfully, with the kind of overachieving nerds in Class 10, he didn't think they would lose anyway. Unbeknownst to them, someone had been eavesdropping. That someone was Nika. Nika had heard the entire exchange and asked with excitement if Chris was having them compete against another class because he believed in them. The academy quickly caught fire with rumors. Whispers filled corridors, growing louder by the second. Students were buzzing. Had anyone heard? Class 10 and Class Y were going head to head. Curiosity spread like wildfire. People muttered in awe. Wasn't Class 10 the class where half the students tried to quit on day one? Where even making eye contact with the teacher was considered dangerous? Then came the real piece of gossip. The one that made jaws drop across campus. It wasn't just about student pride or class rankings. Professor Eugene's date was on the line. Meanwhile, Nika burst into his classroom like a whirlwind, slamming the door open with a dramatic crash. He asked loudly if everyone was already there. Inside, his 4 closest classmates looked up, startled. Dolce lounged at her desk, yawning. She said that she only came because he called it an emergency. She asked what was going on. Angelina, spinning a lock of her ice blue hair between her fingers, let out a sigh. She said she had dinner plans, so whatever it was had better be quick. Nika flashed a grin. He told them they were going up against Class Y. Angelina shrugged and said the teacher had already mentioned it but wondered aloud if there was more to it. Leaning in with exaggerated secrecy, Nika dropped the real bomb. He said that if they lost, Professor Chris would have to go on a date with Eugene. The room went completely still. Eyes widened, mouths dropped open. Dolce nearly choked, asking if he was serious. Angelina laughed in disbelief, asking if he had misheard or was just imagining things. Nika crossed his arms and declared proudly that he was a tot, and tots don't lie. He said he overheard them himself. They were definitely talking about it. Even Michael, who rarely said anything, perked up at that. He asked if it was really a date with their teacher. Dolce chimed in with a teasing grin, suggesting that technically, eating out with someone of the opposite sex counted as a date. She added that it was the first time anyone had heard of Professor Eugene doing something like that. Angelina agreed, saying she always thought of him as more of a lone wolf. Nika then added with dramatic flair that Professor Chris had totally snapped. He recounted how Chris had declared that if Class 10 won, Eugene was never to show his face again. Nika's eyes lit up with fire as he declared that if Professor Eugene believed in them, then they had no choice but to give it everything they had. He emphasized that losing simply wasn't an option. They had to win and make their professor proud. Despite the seriousness of his tone, he admitted he was also just a little curious about the whole date situation. Still, he insisted, there was no way they could allow themselves to lose to Class Y. They couldn't let their professor down. Angelina panicked at the sight of Michael's fists, which had started to spark with magical energy. She pointed it out with alarm and told him to calm down before he accidentally set something on fire. Meanwhile, Professor Chris stood silently at the edge of the training ground, watching as students from both classes gathered. He sighed heavily, his thoughts trailing toward the absurdity of the situation. This whole date rumor had gotten way too far out of control. Across from him, Professor Eugene approached with his ever-neutral expression. Chris observed the disparity in their class sizes with visible irritation. He mentally noted how uneven it all looked. There was no way this setup was balanced. Eugene broke the silence by explaining the match format. He said it would be one-on-one duels, and the first team to achieve 3 wins would be declared the victor. Chris scoffed at the structure, remarking that it all seemed like such a hassle. He sarcastically suggested it might be quicker to just throw everyone in and let them brawl it out. Eugene calmly countered that it was too early in their training to be teaching team battles. Chris raised a brow at that, thinking about how his students had already performed combo attacks like it was second nature. That main character buff really was something else. Without hesitation, he was told to pick his first fighter. Chris didn't overthink it. His strategy was simple, level up and smash through everything. Nika was his first choice. Nika stood at attention, offering a proud salute. He said he would return victorious. Chris, deadpan, reminded him that it wasn't a battle to the death, but he appreciated the enthusiasm. The arena buzzed with anticipation. The referee raised a hand and announced the first match, Nika Todd versus Serena Gale. The rules were simple. Whoever hit 0 health first would lose, and the match would end instantly. He ordered the fighters to take their positions and began the countdown. 3, 2, 1. Begin. Serena lunged in aggressively, her blade cutting through the air, but Nika met her with perfect timing. He inhaled, then countered with a clean, powerful arc of his sword. There was a loud clang, and Serena went flying. She dropped to the ground, stunned. The crowd gasped. The referee declared Class 10's Nika Todd the winner of the first round. Nika jogged over to his opponent and offered a hand. He asked if she was all right and offered to help her up. Serena gritted her teeth but managed a faint smile, promising to win next time. Chris blinked in disbelief. He looked around, expecting shock, but no one else seemed fazed. He overheard murmurs from other teachers. They said it wasn't surprising. It was the Tots, after all. High expectations came with the name. Chris nearly choked. That kind of power from a support class? He couldn't believe it. Off to the side, Michael beamed with pride and commented on how strong Nika had become. Chris exhaled, feeling a strange mix of relief and awe. At least he wasn't the only one blown away. Eugene, calm as ever, asked who was next. Chris smirked and pretended to ponder it, but he already knew. His next pick was Angelina. Angelina straightened immediately and said with confidence that she would bring home another win. Chris had already calculated the rest. With Angelina in play, this could be wrapped up quickly. There was no need to risk the healers or the rookies. Michael looked up at Chris, his eyes hopeful. He silently begged for a chance. Dolce giggled and teased him, wondering why he was giving her such a look. The referee's voice cut in. The second match was about to begin. Angelina summoned her ice spear, shimmering with raw magic, and charge. Her opponent parried, but her rapid and unrelenting strikes forced them backward. Teachers on the sidelines whispered in recognition. They acknowledged her as the heir of the sheriff family, her ice magic textbook perfect. Chris's jaw slackened slightly as he watched the battle. The sound effects alone, those sparkles and crashes, made it feel cinematic. It was seriously cool. With a final, blinding thrust, Angelina knocked her opponent off their feet. The referee raised a hand and called it. Class 10's Angelina Sheriff had taken the second win. Angelina gave a satisfied grin and looked over at Chris with a proud glint in her eyes. Chris thought she looked like a smug family pet waiting for praise. He wanted to acknowledge her, but had to stay in character. He barked at her to get back in line. Angelina flinched and replied that she was already on her way. Eugene, meanwhile, crossed his arms and noted aloud that just one more win would end it for them. Chris cracked his knuckles and declared it was time to finish things. He called out his next fighter, Dolce. But then, suddenly and loudly, she raised her hand and announced her forfeit. Gasps echoed around her. Nika's eyes widened in confusion. He asked if she was sick or maybe if she was giving up to let the professor go on a date. Chris turned his head sharply. He thought to himself, what's a date? But he pushed that aside and asked Dolce for her reason directly. Had she gotten cold feet? Dolce shook her head with her usual easygoing smile and said it wasn't that. She explained that it just didn't feel fair. Technically, she said, she shouldn't be allowed to compete in a one-on-one match. Chris frowned slightly. Deep inside, he knew she had a point. Dolce had an invisible sixth member of the protagonist party. Her twin sister. But that fact was supposed to remain a tightly guarded secret. No one else was supposed to know about the existence of her twin due to complicated circumstances. He watched her closely, trying to figure out what she was plotting. Dolce turned toward Michael with a teasing gleam in her eye and declared that he would take her place. Chris sighed inwardly. Of course. She was trying to hand the spotlight to the protagonist. She likely thought it was time to let him shine. Chris didn't really mind. Losing once wouldn't be the end of the world. He called out to Michael, asking if he was ready. Michael stepped forward, fists clenched, eyes blazing with determination. He said he would give it his all and make sure to win. Chris nodded mentally. It was just a match between students. It should be fine. The match officially began. Michael stepped into the arena with tense shoulders and a burning resolve. Across from him stood a student with a twisted grin and eyes full of malice, the academy's most notorious bully. The bully sneered as he locked eyes with Michael. He said that Michael, a filthy, cursed commoner, should feel honored just to face him in combat. From the sidelines, Chris's expression changed instantly. His eyes widened, and cold sweat trickled down his back. He realized, too late, that this was one of those mob characters, those generic bullies written into the world specifically to torment the protagonist. The bully stepped closer, mockery thick in his voice. He called out to Michael, goading him to say something, anything. But Michael stood motionless. His face was pale, locked in place, his jaw clenched. He couldn't respond. Chris tensed. He knew characters like this existed in the scenario, but the timing couldn't be worse. The bully, sensing weakness, doubled down. Then came the unforgivable line. He asked Michael how it felt to enroll at the academy after killing his own mother, calling him trash. Michael's entire body reacted violently. His posture stiffened, his features twisted with pain, and rage pulsed behind his eyes. A sharp, splitting headache struck him, and through gritted teeth, he managed only a broken warning. He told the bully not to say that. Chris's heart pounded in his chest. He recognized the signs instantly. This wasn't just a spike in magic power. This was something else entirely. This was the aftermath of the incomplete awakening from before. Whatever it was, it had left Michael dangerously unstable. Chris's gut twisted. He thought frantically, this was bad. This was a berserk transformation. The bully, clueless and arrogant, just laughed. He told Michael to stay still and boasted that he'd finish the match in a single blow. Chris couldn't take any more. The time for playing roles was over. Without hesitation, he shouted across the arena, "The match is cancelled." But he was too late. An overwhelming, pitch-black aura erupted from Michael's body. It poured out like ink from a shattered bottle, forming a storm of malevolence around him. The air turned heavy, crackling with unstable energy. Students and teachers alike froze in place, horror painted across their faces. Chris stood frozen for a moment. It was already too far gone. Michael had fully transformed into a monster. His face contorted, no longer human. His true self had been completely submerged under a tidal wave of demonic energy. Panic swept through the crowd. Screams erupted from the bleachers. "Monster! Monster!" Students shrieked and scrambled for the exits. The bully who had just moments earlier taunted him now trembled, eyes wide with terror. He begged for someone, anyone, to help him, his voice cracking in desperation. At that moment, a familiar ding echoed in Chris's mind. A system window popped up in front of him. Quest difficulty may change depending on the situation. Please successfully complete the class as a teacher. Chris's jaw locked tight. He cursed under his breath. They were doing it again. The system was throwing impossible demands at him. They wanted him to stop the protagonist's rampage, physically. He had no other choice. With no time to spare, Chris sprang into action. The students gasped as he marched toward the chaos without hesitation. Someone shouted his name in alarm. "Teacher Chris." Chris clenched his fists. He reminded himself that, at the very least, this environment was designed so no one could die. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a sliver of Michael left inside. But just before he could reach the boy, Eugene stepped in. The other teacher appeared beside him, chanting quickly and conjuring glowing magical chains. He launched the bindings toward Michael, wrapping them around his body. The hope lasted only seconds. With a guttural roar, Michael snapped the chains like thread. A pulse of corrupted magic exploded outward, sending Eugene flying across the arena. He crashed hard, unconscious. The crowd erupted in screams. Another teacher cried out, ordering everyone to fall back and for faculty to prepare restraining spells. But panic spread just as quickly as the aura. One teacher screamed that it was no use. The magic wasn't working. The corrupted energy was disrupting everything. Voices echoed, "It's impossible, we can't stop him. Teacher Chris. Run." But Chris stood firm. He stepped into the dense, suffocating fog of energy, completely unflinching. Michael's monstrous figure twitched and froze. His glowing eyes locked onto Chris. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered inside them. One student whispered aloud that Chris wouldn't run. If it was him, he'd never abandon them. Michael, through the storm of darkness, trembled. His voice, weak and cracked, managed to form a plea. He begged Chris to run. He told him to get away, to save himself. Chris took a slow breath. His hands were shaking, but he buried the fear. He couldn't afford to break character now. Not when Michael was still reachable. He stepped forward and stared directly into his monstrous gaze. Michael stiffened, his body trembling again, but this time with hesitation. In a blink, Chris launched a kick into Michael's knee, knocking him off balance. As he fell forward, Chris caught him by the collar and yanked him close, his eyes burning with intensity. His voice cut through the fog, cold and absolute. "Is this the strength you wanted?" He told him that no matter what kind of fate he carried, if he truly resolved himself, he could become strong. That was why he had said it, because Michael had the power to change. But if he chose this path, there wouldn't be another chance. He stared into him. "Come back." The words struck like a bell in Michael's soul. The demonic fog faltered. His monstrous aura flickered, then dimmed. The pressure in the air began to lessen. "Come back, Michael." His eyes quivered. Slowly, painfully, his body began to settle. The real Michael reemerged, tired, broken, but still there. Chris walked away from Michael, keeping a steady pace until the crowd was far behind him. Once he reached a quiet spot, safely out of sight, he clenched his teeth and screamed inwardly in pain. His hands were scorched. The contact with Michael's demonic energy had seared through him. As he bit back the agony, a familiar system notification flashed before his eyes, alerting him that the quest was now complete. The reward list appeared. A Vidal Academy map and a rotten Mandragora route. His map updated in real time. A new feature unlocked, location detection. As for the route, it was marked as a consumable item. It increased recovery speed by 200%, but with an unknown side effect. The system stated plainly that all Chapter 1 quests were now officially complete. Opening the map function, Chris checked his surroundings, even though his mind lingered on Michael. Concern tugged at him, but instead of heading toward the protagonist, he turned down another path and entered a building. Inside, he moved quietly, sneaking past the corridors. He told himself that hiding like this didn't match his character setting at all, but it was as if some trauma had triggered this habit. Perhaps the lingering fear of losing another disciple was to blame. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. The voice said that they knew Chris would come. It was Eugene. As Chris looked up, he saw Eugene sitting up on a bed, his chest heavily bandaged. Eugene remarked that Chris was truly a good person and invited him in. Chris thought immediately that Eugene had sharp instincts. Chris admitted aloud that what he had done earlier was foolish. Eugene responded with a laugh and said that he had figured that much out. Chris thought back to that moment. Eugene had jumped in without using any protective magic. He wondered if it was raw courage, or just plain stupidity. Eugene, still smiling brightly, explained that he had been confident he wouldn't die. If it meant owing a favor to the master, then it was a cheap price to pay in his view. Chris, gritting his teeth, cursed him inwardly. Eugene then asked about the bet. He wanted to know the outcome. If it came down to match wins, then Class 10 had clearly triumphed. Chris confirmed with cool indifference that Eugene had lost. Eugene grinned and declared that to celebrate Chris's win, he would treat him. Chris made a face of pure disgust and pointed out that Eugene was skipping the premise. Eugene laughed and claimed that he must have hit his head because he didn't remember things clearly. Chris turned his back and began to leave, saying that this was strictly a personal invitation. If Eugene really wanted to contact him, he was free to do so anytime. Behind him, Eugene squealed dramatically that he couldn't handle this kind of tsundere behavior. Once outside the room, Chris's cool facade collapsed. Panic hit him like a wave. He began questioning what had just happened. What was going on? Since when did this game have a dating element? He barely had time to think when a new system notification appeared, announcing that starting from Chapter 2, the story would branch depending on player choices. A new tab had unlocked. The route selection screen. 3 options blinked before him: Demon Lord route, Holy Emperor route, and the ominously titled Do Not Choose route. He raised an eyebrow and wondered what kind of twisted logic lay behind that last one. Also, why were there heart icons next to each choice? For now, He tapped to view the explanation behind each route. First, he selected the Demon Lord route. The system informed him that in this route, he had infiltrated Vidal Academy as a spy for the Demon Lord. His objective was to lure Michael Foxon to the demon's side and conquer the world. Individuals aligned with the demon side would become friendly, while those allied with the Holy Emperor would turn hostile. Next, he clicked on the Holy Emperor route. This one stated that Chris had betrayed the Demon Lord and decided to cultivate heroes within the Academy. His goal was to secure Michael's loyalty to the Holy Emperor and prevent the demon's resurrection. Demon-affiliated characters would become hostile, while the Holy Emperor's allies would treat him more favorably. Chris thought to himself that if he followed this path, he'd have to train Michael as a holy knight. Then he selected the Do Not Choose route. The system asked in disbelief, "Not choosing? Really?" It labeled the route as a terrible option for indecisive, incompetent players. Characters on both sides would become suspicious of him. Chris considered the warning. He acknowledged internally that being part of a faction offered more security, but each path had a major drawback. Choosing the Holy Emperor route meant dealing with someone like Maria. But if he aligned with the Demon Lord, Eugene would become his enemy, a fate he absolutely didn't want. That left only one path. He tapped the screen, accepting the Do Not Choose route, and muttered that there was no turning back now. At first, he didn't regret it. But that didn't last. The flutter of a butterfly's wings, he thought, could stir up a storm. Any consequence was fair game now. He found himself shouting aloud in his room, questioning why he, a supposed main character, was suddenly being thrown out of his job the very next day. He remembered the look on his colleague's face when she told him that he was now on leave, per the principal's orders. She would be taking over Class 10 starting tomorrow. The reason? The principal claimed Chris had been acting too independently, so he was being put on temporary leave. Chris suddenly remembered the system warning. Individuals on both sides would become wary. He connected the dots. His choice of the Do Not Choose route had officially branded him as suspicious. Rumors began circulating throughout the school. He collapsed on his bed with a groan, admitting that the other routes were still too dangerous. Besides, his character was supposed to be unreadable. He never expected to be kicked out for it, though. The Demon Lord route was too dangerous to even consider, and the phrasing in the Holy Emperor route, "pledge loyalty," bothered him. Fanatics never used that kind of language without reason. Because of his character setting, he couldn't even grovel and beg them to reconsider. Just as he began to convince himself to enjoy this rare vacation, another system notification hit him. Parent Master Day was approaching. He froze. This was the first time he had even heard of it. The system explained that the students' parents were naturally curious about how their tuition fees were being used. As a master living off their money, Chris was required to make the event a success for Class 10. A reward box would be given upon success. Failure, naturally, would result in death. He had 72 hours. Chris exploded in frustration, yelling at the absurdity of holding a Parent Master Day for students who weren't even in elementary school. He questioned whether he could even prepare a class worth showing. But more urgently, he was currently unemployed. Determined, he clenched his fists. Vacation was over before it began. He had 72 hours to return to work and survive. The sun cast a steady warmth over the academy grounds when the silence of the classroom broke. The professor was absent, and Belle's brow creased. She recalled that the professor had mentioned a substitute would be filling in for a while, though the reason remained unclear. No one had been told why. Dolce let out an impatient hum. She muttered that the professor had probably had enough of them and chosen to walk away from the class altogether. Her chin rested lazily on her hand, her gaze distant and chilled. Belle observed her in silence, thinking that Dolce was never meant to be confined to classrooms, restless, detached, and unmistakably bored. Angelina's voice rose sharply then. She declared that it was unfair to slander the professor like that, especially when he wasn't present to defend himself. Dolce turned her head slowly, her voice slicing through the air as she replied that anyone with a face like Angelina's had no business talking about sincerity. Angelina flushed bright red, demanding to know what exactly was wrong with her face. Belle stepped in, trying to diffuse the tension. She suggested gently that maybe the professor just needed time off, or that perhaps something serious had happened. A glint flashed off Nika's glasses as realization hit. His fists clenched tightly as he announced with sudden certainty that the professor must have taken the fall for the recent incident. Michael said nothing, simply watching. He knew that the professor would be called to various places after what happened, but he thought that the principal had already settled everything. Yet under the desk, Michael's hands trembled, gripping tighter as clarity set in. He knew now, it was the professor who had shouldered the blame for him. Regret swelled in his eyes. If only he had possessed that same strength, he thought, he might have changed. He hadn't even had the chance to thank him. He stood up suddenly. No matter what, he swore to himself, he would bring the professor back, himself. Sometime later, the door burst open. Nika bursts in and calls out urgently to the substitute professor. His voice cracked as he pleaded for her to get the principal. The substitute professor looked irritated. It was the third disruption that day. But before she could protest, Nika interrupted, his voice shaking as he insisted that this was serious. He warned that Michael was about to lose control. The substitute professor rubbed her temples and sighed, asking how many times she was expected to tolerate this kind of drama. She thought bitterly that these noble-born students were always causing scenes, always bending the school's rules to their whims. None of them ever listened. How much longer would she be forced to play along? Finally, she muttered that if they were so desperate for another outburst, fine, she would check on it herself. She rose and opened the door. There stood Michael, hunched over and clutching his head, groaning that something inside him was about to burst. Dolce scoffed that his performance lacked conviction and advised him to loosen a few buttons for effect, maybe add some passion. Angelina and Belle followed suit, chiming in theatrically, promising they'd personally heal anyone who got hurt. The substitute professor stared in disbelief. Their acting was atrocious. Her voice remained composed as she explained to Michael that if a student truly lost control at the academy, the magical alarm system would activate immediately and alert the staff. Since no such alarm had sounded, she concluded that there was no real threat. Michael's face burned with embarrassment as he offered a quiet apology. Nika grabbed the professor's arm, desperation flaring in his voice as he cried that he couldn't give up, that only Professor Chris could truly bring calm to Michael, and that all he wanted was for the professor to come back. She saw it now. This had been their plan all along. Of course. Chris again. It was always Chris. A raw, wordless fire stirred inside her. Why was that man's name always on their lips? What made him so irreplaceable? That crude, volatile man. What power did he hold over everyone? The substitute professor turned her gaze away, reminding herself that she only needed to survive until the public lecture was over. After that, she simply had to win the approval of the students' influential families. Outside, the wind tugged at the faded sign of a tavern. The Digging Tavern, the paint red, half-peeled, barely clinging to the wood. Inside, the bartender poured cheap liquor into chipped clay cups, casting occasional glances at the solitary figure at the bar. In 50 years of running this place, he thought, he had never seen anyone like that man. 3 hours had passed, and the stranger hadn't moved. His dark reflection floated in the liquor's surface. The air inside thickened like smoke. Not a single other customer dared enter. It was as if the man's very presence was enough to choke the life out of the room. The bartender tried to name the feeling that clung to his skin. Was this dread? Pressure? What kind of creature could carry such weight? Then, from beneath the shadowed cloak, the man's crimson eyes opened, slowly, deliberately. The bartender froze. He wondered if he had just served liquor to a demon king in exile. A single drop of red liquid fell to the floor and spread like a bloodstain. The bartender's stomach dropped. Is this how my tavern ends? The door creaked open. A gust of air swept in. The bartender startled, whispering in disbelief that it couldn't be. He forced a smile and turned to greet the newcomer, but the smile faltered. His face drained of color. Standing in the doorway was a tall man with long blue hair, his posture stately, his aura unmistakably noble. It was Duke Seraph, Angelina's father. The bartender stammered the Duke's name, unable to hide his shock. A boy with bright orange hair tugged at the Duke's sleeve, muttering that he had warned him not to take off the hood. Then a woman entered. Her stride was confident, her eyes sharp. Natasha Tot, Nika's mother. She glanced at the bartender and commented that the poor man looked so spooked he couldn't even speak. The bartender nearly blacked out. How could someone talk like that to a duke? The duke gave her a sidelong look and remarked that he didn't recall ever attempting to seduce anyone. Natasha laughed lightly and said that no one had accused him of that, but it was nice to hear he acknowledged he was handsome. Next came a red-haired man in glasses. He moved stiffly, with the weariness of someone unused to standing for long. Henry Bright, Dolce's father. He commented flatly that perhaps they should find a room before his legs gave out. Henry approached the counter, and the bartender nearly sighed in relief. At last, someone who seemed sane. Henry dropped 3 gleaming magic crystals onto the bar and said they needed 3 rooms, asking if that would cover the cost. He added that he'd been locked up for 80 years and wasn't up to date on prices. The bartender's jaw fell open. One of those crystals could buy the entire street. He had just laid down 3. Then something else hit him. Did he say 80 years? Natasha's brow furrowed. She asked what that was supposed to mean, then turned to Henry and said there was something about him she had always wondered. Her hand moved without warning, fluid as water. In one smooth motion, her blade was drawn, and the tip pressed against the back of Chris, who was still seated at the bar. Her voice was cold as she said that his killing intent had been leaking ever since they entered. She asked if he had business with them. Chris raised his glass, unmoved. But before it reached his lips, the blade appeared, sharper, swifter. Chris's low voice echoed through the tavern. He warned that if she didn't back off, he'd crush her skull. Natasha chuckled, amused. She said she was simply curious. Which of them would lose their head first? They stood locked in place, the tavern frozen around them. Her blade hovered near his throat. Chris's hand shook, still holding the bottle. He thought to himself that none of this made any sense. All he had done was come downstairs to escape a cockroach. He was sick of the ticking clock in his room and just wanted a quiet drink. Then came the bartender's cheerful welcome, followed by them, Seraph, Tot, and Bright. The Duke of the Knights. The head of the Mage Tower. Why were they here? Then a terrifying word blazed through his mind, parent meeting. No way. His stomach twisted. This is too sudden. I'm not ready. They won't recognize me, right? He had stayed in the corner, hoping to vanish into it like a roach. If he kept quiet, maybe they'd leave. But life never let him off easy. Natasha's gaze returned to him. She said his killing intent was still rising, and his presence alone was suffocating. Chris didn't blink. He knew, if he looked away, he'd be dead. This wasn't just anyone. This was Natasha Tot, famed Red Knight, mother of an honors student, and one of the kingdom's most elite warriors. Her eyes dropped to the sword at his hip. She asked why he hadn't drawn it. Was it just for decoration? Chris panicked. When did she notice my sword? That blade could only be drawn 3 times in total. He couldn't afford to waste one now. Then it clicked. She was a knight. If he didn't strike first, she wouldn't either. Thank the gods he hadn't acted on impulse. Let's keep it simple. He told her that this wine's better than anything in the Red Kingdom. He stayed still, calculating before continuing to say that if he drew his sword now, this entire block would be gone. He said grimly that then no one will ever taste this wine again. Which would be a waste. He took a slow sip and mused that if the bartender kept charging so little for this, he'd go broke by next week. Natasha broke into laughter. She said it was ridiculous. That in a moment like this, he was actually worried about the tavern's future. She sheathed her blade and apologized for the intrusion, introducing herself as Natasha Tot, newly appointed Red Knight. Chris stared, noting how fast her tone had changed. She replied that correcting one's behavior wasn't weakness. What was weak was a knight who endangered civilians under the guise of protecting them. Turning to the bartender, she said she'd buy every bottle in the place as compensation. Then she looked back at Chris and said there were things they needed to discuss. She called the others over. Seraph, Bright, she said, come here. Chris didn't move. It's over, he thought. This night won't end. The 3 of them gathered around him. Seraph muttered that he'd stick to water. Natasha lifted her glass and said the liquor here tasted far better than any water in their kingdom, according to Chris. As night fell, Chris stared into the bottom of his glass and silently begged, someone, please save me. Later, he lay sprawled in bed, feeling half dead. He sat up slowly, holding his head, fighting off nausea. He had somehow survived the night. Just as he was about to slip away back to his room, Natasha stopped him. She said she knew he planned to return to the academy, and told him to pack. They were leaving together. They had to move fast, she explained, and it was all thanks to Duke Seraph, who, as it turned out, suffered from a devastating case of social anxiety. He had insisted on arriving before everyone else. If that were the only reason, staying behind would have made just as much sense. They hadn't traveled all this way just for a parent visitation day. No, it was clearly about the incident at the academy. The rumors were already out. A student, one who couldn't be restrained by ordinary magic, had transformed into something monstrous and attacked a teacher. This so-called open day was just a mask. What they truly wanted was to lay eyes on that monster themselves. Chris stepped out of the tavern, only to find Natasha waiting for him at the edge of the path. She remarked that he was incredibly slow. With a calm, almost teasing smile, she told him that his face looked terrible and instructed him to take her arm. If he felt faint, she said, he should lean on her. Chris froze. Had his drunken act been too convincing? Then Duke Seraph stepped closer, and to Chris's horror, the man looked genuinely concerned for his well-being. A wave of dizziness hit him. This felt like he was being escorted. Rain began to fall in a soft drizzle. Henry called for them to pick up the pace, and Natasha, still cheerful, noted how chatting made time pass quickly. Chris gritted his teeth. He was pretty sure only she had been talking. As the academy gates came into view, something shot from the trees. Chris reacted instinctively, slipping on the wet ground. Natasha caught him effortlessly and asked if he was all right. Then, without hesitation, offered to carry him. Shouts rang out from the distance. Students were calling for their teacher. Chris hissed for silence, but before he could do anything, a beam of golden light sliced through the rain. Nika's longsword caught Natasha's arm mid-motion. Taught family light magic, unmistakable. Chris stared, stunned. That young man, was that Nika? It couldn't be. Natasha blinked in surprise. She said she had mistaken the situation for an ambush, but judging by his reaction time, her son had grown. Nika, jaw tight and grip firm on his blade, demanded to know why his mother was abducting his teacher. Chris remained perfectly still, Natasha's arm still around him. This was it. His cover was completely blown. He must have assumed he'd been kidnapped. And what was worse, it seems he wasn't the only person who had managed to sneak onto campus early. The students ran toward him, shouting that it really was him, their teacher, Chris. Angelina's voice broke with relief as she said she'd always believed he hadn't been kidnapped. Cruz thought, as suspected, they had clearly jumped the wall to get inside. Chris let out a heavy sigh and said they could have at least asked before creating this mess. Arms crossed, his tone turned sharp as he demanded an explanation. His eyes landed on Michael, who recoiled at the sound of his name. The boy clutched his collar tightly, eyes burning red as he cried out for his teacher. Rain streaked the stone path as Michael stood before Chris, stammering that he thought the professor had abandoned them. He said that was why they all went searching, to see him one last time, to finally apologize, to say thank you. His voice wavered as he asked if Chris would come back to their class. Chris tilted his head, thinking this sounded like something out of a melodrama. He hadn't even done anything worth this kind of devotion. Still, as he looked at the drenched, trembling student, something in him softened. These students were strange. And yet, they made him want to be better. He exhaled and muttered that they'd be nothing but trouble. Then he raised his chin and told them to return, back to the academy. Surprisingly, everything after that went smoothly. In the grand hall, noble parents chatted with careless familiarity. One waved for Lily and asked what horrors she'd put the professor through to make him vanish mid-semester. Another claimed Chris was the only teacher who could handle his granddaughter. A third declared that someone of his caliber was rare even in their lineage. Chris thought wryly that whether through pressure or flattery, the parents had made his return official. Still, facing the silent classroom, he wondered what he was even supposed to teach. He wrote independent study on the board. Natasha lit up, saying how unique it was. Bright compared it to Eastern meditation practices. Chris glanced over the class, thinking at least these two were no longer an issue. They'd accepted him. But he had a different problem now. Duke Seraph. The man lounged in the back, face serene. But Chris knew better. He was the one responsible for shaping Angelina into the Academy's perfect princess. A pale hand rose. Angelina asked if she could go to the bathroom. Chris nodded. She stood, and immediately wobbled, hand flying to her mouth. She staggered forward with a strangled noise. Michael reached out to steady her. Duke Seraph narrowed his eyes and remarked that this was unusual. His Angelina didn't act like this. Chris shot up, muttering her name under his breath. He thought she was taking it hard, maybe even sneaking off to smoke again. He sighed and followed. Natasha called out, asking where he was going and if he was abandoning the guests. Chris replied curtly that class was over. There was nothing more to see. Doors closed behind the noble visitors. One muttered that it was a letdown. Duke Seraph stood silent while Bright simply said they should get a drink. Chris reached an ornate door. Muffled sounds leaked through, choked gasps and a low groan. He paused, thinking that Angelina must have wanted privacy this badly just to hide herself here. Then a red light blinked on the wall. Ding! A translucent screen appeared, announcing the quest's completion and prompting him to choose a reward. Options scrolled. Frozen Warrior's Shield, Succubus's Joy, Ultra Popular Man's Cloak. Chris stared, thinking these rewards were getting weirder. He picked whatever fit his character best and dismissed the screen. Right now, none of it mattered. He entered the room. Angelina crouched beside a desk, shoulders shaking, eyes wet with tears. Chris called her real name, Andante Seraph. Shocked, she looked up, stammering. Her voice broke as she wondered how he knew that name. Chris's expression hardened. So it was true. The novel's version of the truth filled his mind. Angelina was actually Andante, a boy whose development had been magically halted to impersonate his gifted younger sister after she disappeared. Chosen for his resemblance and trained through cruelty and brainwashing, Andante had become the perfect Angelina. In the novel, the revelation shattered the fandom. He remembered the outrage in the comment threads. One user screamed that the author had gone insane, another raged and quit, and a third grinned that secrets made characters even better. Andante Seraph, an illegitimate child of mediocre power, was overlooked in favor of Angelina. When she vanished, the Duke didn't search for a replacement. He created one. Magic suppressed Andante's growth, and the trauma inflicted left deep scars. According to the story, he developed severe OCD and lived in constant physical pain. Angelina, no, Andante, sniffled and asked how Chris knew that name. She said that if her father found out, Chris would disappear like the others. She begged him not to go too. Chris remembered with grim clarity that everyone who learned the truth about Andante was silenced by Duke Seraph. He straightened. He said it was always the same with people like them, asked if he looked like someone who could be messed with. He thought it was time to re-establish who he really was. He grinned slightly, already forming his plan. The Seraphs were one of the few families who remained neutral, neither siding with the Demon King nor the Holy Emperor. He thought that aligned perfectly with his own position, but if he wanted to survive, he needed insurance. He looked at Andante and said the name, firm and clear. Andante flinched and begged him to call her Angelina. Chris overrode her gently but firmly. He said that Andante would lead Class 10 to victory in the school tournament. That was the deal. He thought that getting them indebted to him was the fastest way to win. He had read the novel. He knew how to use that knowledge, and in return, he promised to find the missing sister. Andante gasped. Chris added that of course, he would also free the princess trapped inside this charade. A chime rang out. A pane materialized in the air. Main quest. Earth Gods Request 2-2. Objective. Lead Class 10 to victory in the Academy Tournament. Reward. 1 lucky chance. Failure. Death. Time remaining, 14 days. Chris narrowed his eyes. Time to win. The prize from the Academy's internal championship, the first semester tournament. Traditionally, each grade competed separately. The Eye of Flame, embedded with a single red magic crystal, was the symbol of victory. Chris narrowed his eyes. That crystal. He needed it in order to find the real Angelina. Winning should have been simple, but there was a problem. Turning to the class, he stated that everyone already knew the first semester exam was a tournament. Then, slamming both palms on the desk, he announced, with clear disbelief, that this time, all grades would be competing together. If it were easy, he explained, it wouldn't be a real challenge. He had made a promise, during the parent meeting, to Duke Seraph. He remembered his words clearly. If they won the elimination matches, he would find Angelina for him. But there was a condition. Duke Seraph has to free Andante. He recalled being asked if he could be trusted. Now, facing his students, he remembered his own answer. He never made promises he didn't intend to keep. Outwardly calm, but inside, that calm had long since collapsed. He'd assumed they'd be fighting only students from the same year. That assumption was gone now. Nika spoke honestly, saying that while he had some skill, defeating upperclassmen was unrealistic. Michael, however, clenched his fists and declared they would give everything if it meant fulfilling their teacher's wish. Chris's voice was resolute. There would be no turning back. Angelina's followed, equally unwavering. She said there was no other option. They had to win. From a distance, Chris watched in silence. He could see it clearly, how desperate Andante was. He was pushing himself because of what is on stake. But the question haunted her. Could he really turn these students into champions with so little time? Chris frowned. Something felt wrong. Around this time Dolce should be acting annoying like usual, but she's been silent. Nika noticed and called out to her, telling her to calm Angelina down. When no response came, he asked if she was in pain. Then Dolce's voice rang out. She said that every year, around this season, a ghost appeared at the academy. Nika furrowed his brow, asking what she was going on about now. Dolce continued, stating that there were even stories of students who had died during past tournaments. Chris's expression darkened. Damn it, he thought. If Dolce was talking about ghosts, that could only mean the twins were in danger. The sky turned heavy and gray. Days later, the training field stood soaked in rain, statues cold and silent beneath the storm. Nika collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. He said he couldn't continue, that he needed a break. Angelina stood above him, her voice sharp and frozen as she reminded him they hadn't even reached 1,000 repetitions. Belle groaned that her training was brutal and pointed out that Dolce hadn't shown up in days. Angelina's voice came again, crisp and commanding, as she told him to get up. Dolce's absence had nothing to do with his effort. Chris stood off to the side, brows furrowed. Dolce? Missing training? That didn't sit right. They needed a full team of 7 for the tournament. He couldn't afford any gaps. He tapped his fingers against the window frame, calculating how few members they had left. If something had happened to the twins, this could break them. He recalled seeing the younger twin near the inner courtyard recently, wandering like she was searching for something. Rain fell hard over the stones. A fragile voice called out into the downpour. Dolce stood beneath a tree, hair soaked, body trembling. Her voice cracked as she whispered into the storm, "Bana, where are you?" Her voice cracked as it broke into sobs, trembling as she called out the name, Gabbana. From the shadows, Chris watched in silence, his gaze sharpening. So the rumors were true. Gabbana Arclight, Dolce's twin sister, hadn't simply disappeared. She had vanished without a trace. The Arclight twins, 2 of the most promising mages of their generation. Gabbana, the elder, had been declared dead 5 years prior. But Chris could see now that her soul had never truly departed. She stayed by Dolce's side ever since then. Rain merged with Dolce's tears, soaking her as she stood alone in the courtyard. Her voice, unsteady and fading, asked where her sister had gone. The storm swallowed her words, but the despair behind them lingered. Chris narrowed his eyes. Most of his students carried buried pasts, wounds they never spoke of. He knew now, he would have to confront those ghosts, one by one. He stepped forward, gripping Dolce's arm without hesitation. His voice was cold, stripped of compassion, as he demanded an explanation. Dolce looked up, her face streaked with tears and rain. A fragile smile curled on her lips. She said that she hadn't expected him to skip training to find her. She hadn't realized he cared. Chris's expression didn't change. He told her not to get the wrong impression. It wasn't about her. She sank to her knees, rain running down her cheeks like melted sorrow, and asked, if not her, then what? His next words shocked her. He asked where did she lose Gabbana's soulstone. Dolce's eyes widened, then softened into a small, rueful smile. She admitted she was impressed. She had always known her teacher was strange, but she hadn't expected him to sense the soulstone's presence. She confessed she had underestimated him. Chris's gaze stayed locked, unblinking. He stated inwardly that he couldn't sense anything like that. He knew the truth from his past life. In the original tale, Dolce had been the one to find the protagonist and reveal everything. She had carried the secret of the Soul Stone alone. How, before Gabbana's death, she had sealed her sister's soul into a high-grade magic crystal. It allowed Gabbana to remain tethered to the world as a spirit. The cost had been high. Gabbana couldn't stray far from Dolce and was invisible to others. Dolce had always been careful, always measured. Now it made sense. Losing the Soul Stone was like losing her all over again. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. She said that when she woke up that morning, Gabbana was gone. She had searched everywhere, but there was no trace. Without her, Dolce admitted, her magical power was halved. She was barely holding herself together. Chris closed his eyes. Part of him wanted to give her rest, to let her recover, but that luxury didn't exist anymore. The only solution was to end the threat, fast. He told her to follow him. On the map, a faint red mark pulsed, the last location Dolce had visited. For Chris, that glow meant one thing. A threat. Gabbana's Soul Stone hadn't just vanished, it had been consumed. Chris's lips curled into a thin, cold smile. Whatever had devoured it, he thought, would make excellent training for his students. When they reached the murky pond, Nika grumbled in frustration. He asked why they were wasting time out here when they should be preparing for the tournament. He muttered that the whole place gave him the creeps. Like something was waiting to snatch their souls. Angelina snapped at him to stop with the superstitions. Belle, however, looked at Dolce and asked if she was okay. Her face had gone pale. Her shoulders were tense. She knew, even before seeing it, what was waiting. Chris stepped to the edge of the water and turned to face them. He asked if everyone was ready. That was when the pond exploded. Water surged into the sky as a massive, reptilian creature burst from the depths. It shrieked with a sound that seemed to split the air itself. Its body was scaled and bloated, twisted with unnatural bulk. As it landed on the rocks, a stream of black liquid poured from its gaping mouth, eating through stone with a hiss. Nika shouted in disbelief, pointing out that the rocks were melting. Angelina took control instantly. She warned them that the creature's breath was acidic and told them to switch to long-range magic. She ordered Nika and Belle to focus on defense and maintain barrier spells. But Dolce didn't move. Chris noticed. This was the moment, an ideal scenario for a twin water mage, but she stood frozen. What would the old Chris have said? He searched for the words, and found them. His voice rang out, slicing through the chaos. He asked Dolce if she planned to run away again. Her breath caught. The memory slammed into her, tactical class, months ago. She had stood back then too, watching, doing nothing. That had been about Michael, a joke taken too far. But this wasn't a drill. This wasn't training. This was real. The monster reared its head. From its deformed throat, it uttered a broken, warped word. Dolce, her blood ran cold. That voice, it was hers. In that instant, the truth became clear. The creature before her, the thing roaring and spewing acid, was the very being that had swallowed Gabbana's soul. The one she had failed to protect. The one now bound to her by blood and grief. The enemy standing before her was no stranger. It was hers. Something that had almost fused with her very essence. The monster she now had to face was the last piece of her sister. Chris recalls the story of Dolce where rain poured as Dolce sat slumped beneath the tree, Michael resting beside her. She said she had always felt a bitter frustration. Gabbana was human, yet everyone kept insisting otherwise. People whispered that her sister was undead, that she would turn into a monster. No matter how many times she denied it, no one believed her. She said the magic tower had heard of the Soul Stone and tried to seize it for research. That was why she fled to the academy. The thought hung in Chris's mind. The soul inside Gabbana wasn't treated like a girl's. It was treated like the soul of the strongest demon lord hero sealed inside a stone. Chris stood under the storm, black hair plastered to his face, red eyes cold. He said the rumors weren't entirely false. There was a reason behind them. He told her plainly. The monster wasn't her sister. Gabbana was human. He asked what else she could be if she could use magic. Dolce stiffened, rain mixing with tears on her cheeks. She said her teacher was cruel, that she had wanted, just once, to hear those words. But did he really have to say them now? Water spiraled at her command as she stepped toward the monstrous form rising from the pond. She told the others she was sorry for dragging them into her family's mess and promised to repay them. She warned them to hold tight, and with a wave of her hand, a gleaming surge blasted the beast, tearing through rock and mist. Chris watched the monster crumble. He said, without a doubt, the match was theirs. The morning breeze stirred the curtains. Chris lounged on the couch beside the window. He said the monster hunt had likely boosted their chances in the tournament. The students had struggled, sure, but they brought it down. He noted that the beast carried refined magic stones. It must have been the work of that bandaged guy. He'd confiscated the stones, handed them out, and said to eat up. They were risky, but worth it. He warned them to stay alert. Nika's brothers were manageable, but the second years were the real threat. Among them was Rain, mentor, rival, and a headache of a prodigy. He added that Rain was the type to skip class on a whim. A door slammed open. A purple-haired boy stormed in, shouting that he was here to challenge the class that defeated the garden monsters. He demanded the strongest to step out, wagering red hearts. Chris sighed, thinking the kid was unbelievably childish. Speak of the devil, character fanatics, and the tournament hadn't even begun. Chris raised a hand and told everyone to quiet down. The boy pointed dramatically and said that yes, it was him. The one cloaked in chaos, the new generation's leader. Chris ground his teeth, thinking this Brad needed a lesson in respect. Nika leaned over and said the teacher shouldn't waste his time, accusing the intruder of trying to steal strategies. He offered to throw the visitor out himself. Someone accused Ryan of having a lot of time to be bothering their class. Chris retorted that this wasn't how one should speak to a teacher. Internally, he smirked. His student clearly outclassed this fool. The boy scoffed that trying to control someone like him with just a finger was arrogant, then faltered when Chris's eyes glowed red. He muttered that he'd let it slide, for now. Chris stepped forward and said one word. Respect. He told the boy to speak properly to his elders. The boy laughed and said he didn't care about such rules. Chris's aura darkened. He said it was laughable that someone like him called himself the strongest. The boy hesitated, then said that was a separate issue. Chris replied that whoever mastered the character fans would master Rain, and that the boy wasn't worth the time. He told him to leave if he understood. The boy growled that bluffing wouldn't fool his emperor eyes. Chris tapped his cape and said for someone with perfect eyesight, he still wore an eye patch. Fine, time to use what he'd earned recently. System notifications appeared. Super popular guy's cape equipped. Illusion of radiant light. Active. Halo effect. Level 10. MP drain. 100 per second. He stepped forward, bathed in radiant light, and asked if the boy could even see him now. Blinded, the boy staggered. A blow slipped past his guard. He shrieked as a flurry of strikes hit him, ending with a casual forehead flick that sent him reeling. Chris told him to stop pretending and just go home. Red-faced and gasping, the boy muttered that next time, he wanted the teacher to watch him seriously. Chris snorted. Just a loser's last bark. But as he turned away, a thought crossed his mind. Had he just given that kid the motivation to awaken? Later, while walking in the courtyard, a voice called out, "Teacher." Chris turned. A green-haired instructor stepped in with a bright smile and apologized for the disturbance. Chris narrowed his eyes. That fox-eyed man was too smooth. He said that he had actually been Ryan's homeroom teacher last year. He said the boy never listened and drove him insane, and laughed, calling himself invincible. Chris exhaled and said it figured. Not a new problem, then. The green-haired teacher folded his hands and suggested they talk over a meal. Chris's inner voice screamed no. The man caught the expression and said he'd figured as much. He handed Chris a bundle tied with ribbon and said it was just a small token. Chris blinked. A bento? The man flushed and said yes, he could see it that way. Chris weighed the gift. By tournament rules, he couldn't accept it. He'd declared neutrality. For all he knew, it was poisoned. You could never be sure with men like this. The instructor leaned in and said he'd made it himself. No tricks. Chris ordered him to stop talking. He needed to figure out how to win this tournament quickly. Softening his tone, his coworker asked if something was troubling him. He said that in moments like this, he liked to go somewhere quiet to think. The suggestion felt oddly personal, like it wasn't meant for Chris, but for him. The man handed him a map and said he would share his secret base. He added that Chris would figure it out easily by following the map. No one else should be able to find him there. An old, sealed-off dormitory from years ago. The green-haired man said he hoped it would help. Chris's eyes narrowed. Who was this man? At first, he thought the instructor was just being cryptic. But now he was referencing an actual dungeon from the original story. Chris thought, could it be? Chris remembers that the old dorm is a dungeon mentioned only in the protagonist's flashbacks. Only souls who have never tasted defeat can enter. In the original story, the hero believed he was undefeated but was rejected at the door because he had forgotten his loss to the Demon King long ago. Chris thinks that the place never seemed important, yet every faculty member knows about it. He wonders why the man spoke to him with that strange tone and even insisted he would not get caught because of the map. He wonders if the man is tied to the system or if he is like him, but he forces himself to stay level-headed. He decides to let it go for now, turns around, and starts to walk away. As he leaves, he says that he understands nothing and wants the man to get lost. The man only laughs and says that Chris is too harsh. He adds that he will be busy for a while and will not see him, but Chris can call him whenever he misses him and he will come no matter what. Chris thinks that the man is a slick talker and that he needs space to figure things out. That night, Chris stands in front of a massive dungeon, staring up at it. He thinks that he never wanted to come, but he heard that Lionbrat had joined the top third-year class. This tournament is not designed for first years to win. Defeat is almost guaranteed unless he gets a cheat code. A quest or a dungeon is the only path. As he reaches for the door, a brief flash hits him. A white light fills his vision. He freezes, overwhelmed by its size and brightness. He thinks that this must be the dungeon. In this world, dungeon just means an unknown zone, but this place feels entirely empty. Then he stops, hearing a voice calling him. The voice welcomes him, saying that it has been waiting for him and repeating itself with odd, broken rhythm. When he looks ahead, he sees a floating shape. He wonders who would call him a child. The strange toy-like creature speaks again, saying that it feared he had forgotten this place and that it understands because his memory is not complete. It says it can finally help him. Chris realizes it is the monkey Kiring and asks what is going on. The monkey replies that it is part of the Earth Gods and that it serves as his support. Chris cannot hear certain words, but he understands enough. A system message appears. Main quest, Earth God's request. Chris stares at the monkey with suspicion, and the monkey flinches. It asks why he looks so frightening and begs him to listen. It says this kind of meeting always happens when someone encounters a supreme being. Chris tells it to get to the point. The monkey says it wants to explain fully but cannot, because the Earth God is restricted. If Chris fails, things will get complicated. Chris realizes that the missing words must be something he cannot process as a human inside the story. The monkey says it had to bend the rules just to meet him and wanted to help because he was not given enough abilities. It adds that if he is desperate, it can intervene. Chris asks if that means it will grant him a wish. The monkey nods. Chris feels a spark of joy and praises the Earth God, then asks for magic. The monkey refuses, saying that it cannot do anything about illegal players. Chris clenches his fists, furious, thinking that he never chose any of this. He calms himself and asks for strength instead. The monkey refuses again, saying it is unavailable. Chris grows angrier, his eyes sharp like a starved tiger. He asks if the monkey is mocking him. The monkey panics and waves its hands, begging him to stop glaring. Chris asks at least for an item that can help him win the tournament. The monkey considers it, then says that he has defeated the minimum number of monsters, so it is possible. Chris tells it to give him something that will last as long as possible. Light flares from the monkey. Chris squints as it grows intense. He thinks that every time beings like this hand out rewards, something goes wrong. He hopes the trip was worth it. As he shields his eyes, he remembers the monkey saying he had forgotten this place, yet it waited for him. He suddenly asks if the monkey knows Professor Eugene. The monkey is startled and says that no character named Eugene appears in the original story. Chris is shocked. Before he can continue, time jumps. Chris finds himself at the tournament. His students cheer, saying that they knew they would win and that it is thanks to him. Chris is completely confused. A system window appears repeatedly, telling him the quest is complete and that he has received a lucky chance. He grabs his head, thinking that the monkey skipped everything and threw him straight into victory. He knew the system would ruin something again. Michael walks up and says that Chris should accept the trophy, calling it an honor. He smiles as he hands it over. Chris takes the trophy, still sensing that something is off, but at least he got the mana stone. He lifts the trophy with forced enthusiasm and thinks that he will treat it as a substitute for the reward the system never gave him. Angelina bursts into tears, and when he glances at her, he tells his students that they should not get carried away. Angelina wipes her face and insists that they will keep working hard. Chris is sure the princess played a big part in their victory, but he cannot remember anything from the entire missing week. He suddenly stiffens and tells the group that he is heading out. Michael and the others call after him, asking why he will not celebrate longer, but he ignores them and walks away, thinking that he never gets a moment to rest. Before he even leaves the area, the system window flashes again with another quest. It shows the main quest, the Earth God's Request 2-3. It orders him to begin the second day of training and defeat the boss monster with his students. The reward is the professor's grace, and the warning states that failure will mean death. He has 7 days. Chris sighs at the laziness of the system's work. It is more frustrated than he expected and did not even bother providing a location, though that might help him. If he wants to find the real Angelina, he has to face the boss monster anyway. The quest is the top priority. Whatever problem comes next will likely involve squinty eyes. He still cannot believe Eugene is not a character in the story. He wonders if Eugene might also be someone thrown into this world, but he forces himself to stay focused. The real Angelina was taken by the so-called Snow Queen. Her name suggests a beautiful monster, but she is actually a giant mosquito that drains mana. He decides to prepare for the fight instead of worrying about absent people. The scene shifts to the Frost Kingdom. A carriage rolls forward with Chris inside. He has a faint smile as he thinks that the Duke's carriage is on another level and that they will arrive near the boss soon. He had taken more than one carriage because there were too many students, yet somehow he ended up sharing this one with Lion. Lion, overflowing with energy, claims that his Emperor's eye is tingling and that the coming battle will be wild. Michael and Angelina both look irritated but hold themselves together. Chris remembers how Lion begged to join their group until Chris finally relented and allowed him to take part in the boss fight. Chris thinks that Lion must have lost his mind after the tournament, but at least he has some talent. And thanks to obtaining the Eye of Flame, entering the dungeon will not be an issue. Angelina asks if everything will go according to the plan. Chris notes how much she must be worrying now and answers that things will be fine as long as no one does anything reckless. Michael reassures her as well, saying that the professor promised everything would work out and that they will all do their best. Chris laughs quietly, thinking that if not for Angelina's true identity, he would have assumed he was watching a harem romance unfold. Lion then comments that Chris has serious charm and suggests giving Angelina and Michael some privacy. Chris mutters that she is not even who Lion thinks she is. They soon reach the gate. Chris tells them they have arrived at the Kingdom of Frost, the dungeon where the Snow Queen resides. No one has attempted to clear it in a long time. In the original story, the protagonist came here while fighting the Demon King's army and struggled terribly because he had to fight both forces at once. This time, they only have one opponent. He has already explained the boss's attack patterns and strategies to the students. Even if it is tough, knowing how a boss fights makes everything more manageable. He tells them he trusts them all. He raises the red stone, which flashes bright. The system reports that the Snow Queen invites him to the realm of the shards of the false mirror and that the quest difficulty may shift depending on the circumstances. It reminds him that he is the professor and must finish the class safely. A massive white mosquito appears, and Chris feels a chill. The creature looks worse in person, but he has no time to be afraid. They have to strike first. He orders his students to prepare, but when he looks back, they're unresponsive. They clutch their heads, lost in visions of their parents. They are completely immobilized by a psychic attack. Chris swears, realizing everyone is down for the count. The mirror realm was a psychic trap. It is useless for him alone to fight this thing. He needs someone who can use magic and is immune to mental interference. He apologizes silently to a certain girl with pigtails and pulls out the soul stone containing Dolce's sister, Gabbana. The spirit awakens, and he thinks that it worked. Gabbana's form appears before him. He greets her and admits this is a rough introduction. He asks if she specializes in electric magic. Gabbana confirms that she does. Chris studies the fallen students and decides that Belle is the one who needs to wake up first, since she can handle a direct electric shock. He tells Gabbana that she has to jolt Belle awake. As he waits, He reflects on how this world works. The more gentle and fragile someone appears, the more careful you should be. Belle struggles with offensive magic for a reason. Gabbana releases a sharp burst of electricity, and Belle snaps awake. Belle sees Chris standing over her, looking relieved. He thinks that Belle makes up for her weak magic with raw physical power. Nika and Lion may be strong, but their strength relies on their spells. He tells Belle that she should hide her ears and tail. Belle flinches and checks them, and Chris is reminded of what healers truly are. They're werewolf half-breeds. They were raised around violence and brutality, which made them reject violence so strongly that they became obsessively gentle. That gentleness hides their true strength, making them the ultimate hidden weapon. He asks Belle if she can break the binding spell. Belle steels herself and says she will try. Chris plans to avoid using Belle unless absolutely necessary. His attention snaps back to the mosquito, which is returning toward the kingdom. Something frozen in the mountain catches his eye. He realizes it is Angelina's twin sister. He understands this is the person he had been searching for all along. The huge mosquito carries the frozen body downward. He says out loud that it must have been watching quietly because it did not have enough mana, and that he has to stop it before it drains Angelina next. He turns to Belle and asks if she is finished. Belle says she is almost done, but the last student is proving difficult. Chris looks at Michael, who is trapped in deep agony. He thinks that of course the protagonist would have the worst nightmare. He has the darkest childhood of all. Letting him go berserk again would be a disaster, and yet Michael's skills are crucial for this fight. Chris tells Belle to prepare a mind link spell. He will pull Michael back himself. Belle freezes, terrified, and says that entering someone's nightmare could trap him forever. Chris pauses, surprised. The main character in the story had always done this spell easily, so he assumed it was safe. But he cannot back out now. He reminds Belle that they are still trainees, and he is their professor. A leader must carry the burden. He also says she can cut the connection if anything goes wrong, and he trusts she can handle that much. Her fear melts into resolve. She promises that she will protect him and pull him out safely. Chris fixes his hair and says that she finally understands, urging her to hurry before the others get killed. He wonders if he can lower the difficulty. Belle begins the spell, sending Chris into Michael's nightmare. The system warns him that he is entering an unauthorized space, that the world is hostile, and that his data cannot be detected. Chris arrives inside Michael's subconscious. It looks incomplete, like a half-built game. He realizes it must be Michael's childhood village, the place filled with trauma. He remembers the original story. Michael's father, the Demon King, murdered his human mother. No one helped him, and Michael lost control, setting the village ablaze. That tragedy happened in his own home. Chris spots the elm tree from the novel's flashback and walks toward Michael's house. Inside, he finds a young Michael sobbing on the floor with his mother's lifeless body. The Demon King stands over them. Michael is begging for help from anyone. Chris thinks that the scene is worse than he expected. When Michael sees the Demon King, he screams at him, calling him a monster and asking if he killed his mother. Chris steps into the room, and Michael freezes in disbelief. Chris thinks about how the child had desperately wanted a hero in that moment. Michael stares at him, asking who he is. Chris smirks internally and says that he should at least recognize his own professor. Michael's shock melts into recognition. Chris turns his attention to the Demon King. The figure is blurry, its magic unclear. Michael grabs Chris's clothes, begging him not to approach and telling him to run before the monster kills him too. Chris looks down calmly and addresses Michael by name, asking why he should run. Michael trembles and insists that the Demon King will kill him like he killed his mother. Chris smiles faintly and reminds him that he had asked for help. Chris steps forward. Because this world runs on Michael's subconscious, and because Michael sees Chris as overwhelmingly strong, the professor's power here is absolute. The Demon King throws a punch at Chris. Chris raises a hand, thinking that if Michael believes he is the strongest, then he is unstoppable here. A shockwave bursts outward. Michael flinches and shuts his eyes. Chris's voice echoes, telling him not to look away. When Michael opens his eyes, Chris is blocking the Demon King's punch with a single finger. Michael is stunned. That punch was the same one that tore his life apart, yet Chris stops it effortlessly. He thinks that she was always someone who ignored the world's limits, which is why he had always wished she was there during his childhood. Chris asks if Michael stayed trapped in this nightmare simply because he feared such a pathetic opponent. The Demon King pushes harder, but Chris still holds him back with one finger. She tells Michael that she does not care what this creature is or what is going on inside his mind, but she knows something important. She grips the Demon King's fist, twists it, and throws the monster across the floor. It lands hard and begins to dissolve. Chris tells Michael that this is not where he belongs and that he needs to pull himself together. Michael watches the Demon King fade away. He thinks that Chris is right. He has grown past this memory. He cannot waste time lingering in his childhood. He needs to learn and improve. But then he quietly asks if Chris really needs someone like him at all. He doubts himself, wondering if someone who cannot control his power is worth saving. Chris laughs and calls him ridiculous for calling her kind. She flicks his forehead, telling him that he is one of her students. The words hit him deeply. He thinks that as long as he is her student, she will guide him. That is enough. He says they should return. Outside, Belle is shaking both Chris and Michael awake. She calls out to them, panicked. Chris stirs first and opens her eyes. Michael wakes up soon after. Chris looks at him and asks what he is waiting for. He is awake now, so it is time to train. Michael feels a rush of determination and answers resolutely. With everyone recovered, the students join together in the fight against the giant white mosquito. Angelina and Dolce strike in perfect rhythm, but the enormous mosquito counters savagely and sends them crashing to the ground. Angelina grits her teeth, thinking that their matching elements leave her wasting mana, yet if she can endure a little longer she might still save the real Angelina. Before she can rise again, she spots Michael approaching. He apologizes for arriving late and begins gathering fire magic, determined not to let his past chain him again. He vows internally to become the kind of student who will never disappoint his professor, then sends a roaring blast of fire straight into the monster. The explosion tears through the mosquito, finally finishing it off. Chris watches the whole scene with a faint smile, realizing she may have become more invested in these kids than she intended. She wonders if she is simply too good at staying in character. The system then notifies her that the quest is complete and that she has received Professor's grace. After saving Angelina, the group leaves the Frost Kingdom and heads back to the academy by carriage. Inside the carriage, Michael and Lion are fast asleep, snoring loudly. Their noise grates on Chris's nerves. She thinks that Lion did nothing and yet sleeps like a child, while Michael's sudden hero moment rescued the real Angelina. She had been breathing, so Chris fed her the last of the mana stone and sent both girls back to house Seraph. He sighs and decides to inspect his reward. At first glance, Professor's grace looks like a page decorated with cheerful flower stickers. He mutters to himself, confused, wondering why the system is giving kindergarten materials. Then he notices tiny text on the back. They are more useful than they look. He starts thinking about how to use them, but the carriage suddenly jolts. A fierce gust rattles the entire vehicle. Michael and Lion wake in alarm. Lion rubs his eyes and demands to know what happened. Chris listens and immediately recognizes the sound. A monster is approaching. Michael asks if they are under attack and checks if everyone is all right. Lion grins and insists that the dark horde must be chasing him out of jealousy. Michael rolls his eyes, and Chris thinks dryly that Lion should at least pretend to stay composed. Michael then turns to Chris, asking whether they should run or fight. Chris notices a new fire in his eyes, sensing a deeper trust after the boss battle. He sighs inwardly. Michael should not be this blindly loyal, but Chris has a good idea of who is coming. He decides to take a risk. He orders both boys to keep their eyes shut until told otherwise. They obey instantly. The system chimes that Professor's grace is now active. Chris smirks, recalling the conditions of the item. When students behave well, compliment them and give them stickers. He mutters to himself that this is a ridiculous situation for praise, but he plays along anyway, telling the boys they did well waiting for the enemy's mana to weaken and praising their cowardice. The system does not seem to understand sarcasm. A cold voice cuts through the air, saying that Chris's tricks are meaningless without eye contact. A cloaked, bandage-wrapped figure stands atop the moving carriage, perched on a monstrous creature. The man remarks that Chris is being harsh after so long apart and claims his feelings are wounded. Chris narrows her eyes. She realizes that she should have met this enemy inside the dungeon, meaning the Demon King has been keeping an eye on them. She asks about the other carriage. The man chuckles and says his pets are dealing with it, since everyone he wants is gathered here. Chris curses inwardly. The bandaged man assures her he is not here to kill anyone today, but she sizes up the situation. The monsters may be dangerous, but he is the real threat. Eye contact with him freezes abilities, shutting down magic instantly. She decides this will become training in sensing mana blind. She steps aside, positioning Michael and Lion forward, and instructs them to feel the altered mana flow and grasp the situation with their whole bodies. Lion blinks, not understanding, but before he can speak, the man raises his hand and announces that this is a test for his young lord. If Chris participates, it counts as cheating. He casts bind magic. Glowing chains whip out and coil around Chris, locking her in place. Michael panics and yells at the man, demanding to know what he has done. The man says that he is simply following orders and warns Michael not to try breaking the chains. The stronger the bound person is, the tighter they constrict, and Chris is extremely strong. Michael shouts for Chris not to worry and to take care of herself. Lion assures her boldly to just keep watch while he handles things. Chris tests the chains lightly and thinks with dry amusement that they feel like jelly. She cannot break them yet. This is actually the perfect chance to see how well the stickers work. She urges her students mentally to fight and prove themselves. The bandaged man laughs and calls his monsters forward, saying it is time to awaken the young lord's power. Michael clenches his fists in frustration. He has little energy left after the dungeon, but something shifts. The stickers Chris gave them begin to glow. Radiant energy flows into Michael, filling him with warm power. He gasps, sensing his magic not just restored but amplified. He unleashes a blue flame spell, blasting a dragon-like monster and shaking the entire carriage. Lion bursts into wild laughter, claiming he can hear demons breathing and that his power is out of control. The bandaged man stares, stunned. Their mana should have been empty after the dungeon, yet they fight like reservoirs overflowing with power, despite having no mana stones. His gaze sharpens toward Chris. Blood drips from her mouth, but she is still smiling with defiance. He shivers. She must have done something unimaginable. Yes, this is the Dame Chris he remembers, fearless, relentless, ever powerful. Meanwhile, Michael and Lion burn through the mana recklessly, shouting in excitement. Michael declares that it must be a gift from the professor and swears not to waste it. Chris stays silent outwardly, but inside she is screaming at them to stop draining her mana. S rank or not, they will empty her dry. Then the system informs her calmly that Professor's grace transfers her power to anyone wearing the stickers, and that her S-rank mana is currently being siphoned at full force. Explosions shake the sky as Michael and Lion, still bound to Chris by glowing chains, pour mana into their attacks. Blue fire thunders from Michael while Lion's power whips around him in erratic waves. Chris thinks that since all she can provide is mana, she offered them an endless supply, yet it feels as if two giant mosquitoes are draining her dry. The bandaged mage presses close beside her and says that his dear Dame Chris does not need to work so hard, then calls to Michael to go play with their little puppy because the adults should talk. Chris thinks the nickname is absurd and tells him she has nothing to discuss. He asks if she still clings to her pride, insists that this pride is what makes her irresistible, adds that even she must be struggling with his lord's curse, and marvels that it has been a long time since he saw her bleed. A shiver runs through Chris. She wonders if this maniac is even remotely sane. Watching the chains, he asks what spell she used to push the boys like this and says that with so much mana draining she must be in agony. Chris groans through clenched teeth, sweating hard, and concludes that of course he is unhinged. He flushes, saying it is beautiful how she refuses to yield while soaked in sweat, once again calling her his dear Dame Chris. She fumes that she is only sweating because he is revolting. Then she pauses. The performance she improvised, pretending to be overwhelmed by the curse, seems accurate enough to fool even someone who knew the real Chris. Something is undeniably off. Suddenly Michael charges, eyes blazing, screaming that the enemy should not go near their professor and that he already warned them to stay away from her. The bandaged mage jolts in surprise and admits that the outburst scared him. Michael and Lion race over. Michael asks if the professor is alright and reports that they defeated all the monsters, while the upperclassman complains that Michael left him to clean everything up. Still chained and keeping her eyes closed, Chris says that they took long enough and tells Michael he can look now. He sees the blood at her lips, panics, and insists on breaking the chains. Chris ends it with a curt order to forget it. She flexes once, snaps the bindings apart, and leaves everyone speechless. She turns away and tells the bandaged mage never to approach her again, thinking that thanks to his bizarre fixation she maintained the illusion of being captured on purpose. Behind her, the curse recoils. Purple-black fire erupts around the bandaged mage as he groans that he cannot believe she withstood the curse so calmly. Chris observes that the penalty hits him now that she broke it. The curse is the Demon King's, and it always hurts the user. He straightens, calls for Dame Chris to watch him embrace every ounce of pain she endured, and collapses into manic laughter. Chris winces and thinks he should keep that to himself. She calls Michael and Lion and tells them they are leaving. Michael answers at once and asks her to slow down, while Lion yells that the perverted bandage freak is only alive because of her mercy. Days later, sunlight glints on the academy tower. In a bright classroom, a tall silver-haired student enters. Girls whisper about how handsome he is and wonder if he even belongs to their school. Michael jumps when Dolce grabs him, exclaiming that it must be Angelina, asking if he cut her hair and marveling at how tall he has grown. Surrounded by soft light, the silver-haired student smiles and greets them, saying he is telling them, "Hey, guys." Dolce leans toward her friend and says she heard the basics of what happened and guesses he really is a man. Michael yelps and asks if he is the only one who missed this. Dolce reminds him that the professor mentioned it earlier and says he must have been sleeping. Chris hides behind a red book, exhausted since the dungeon, yet his eyes keep drifting toward the newcomer. He admits internally that Andante is genuinely handsome. A calm explanation runs through his mind. Once Angelina returned from the dungeon, the Duke removed the growth-stunting spell. Once the real Angelina recovers, she will join the academy, and for now the princess has reverted to Andante. Seeing him in person feels far more vivid than reading about it. Dolce remarks that the real issue is how he plans to handle the chaos his good looks caused. Andante answers that it is only happening because Angelina keeps telling everyone they are related. Inwardly, Chris thinks it sounds just like her, as if she wants all attention directed at her brother, even if the uproar is ridiculous. At the front, Andante sighs. He apologizes if his presence is distracting and promises to talk to the girls later. Dolce exclaims that Andante has gotten strangely nice, believing both his appearance and personality matured, secretly proud of him. The bell rings, and before anyone can even call class to order, a swarm of girls rushes in, screaming Andante's name and begging him to come over. A flustered tiny Andante tries to calm them. Chris imagines slipping away unnoticed. Later, beneath a tree under a calm blue sky, Chris rests alone. From nearby corridors, distant shrieks echo. He thinks the academy girls are outrageous and that Andante is probably hiding. Heavy footsteps approach, and Andante bursts into view, panting and asking if the girls will chase him here too. Chris bristles, thinking this is supposed to be his hideaway. Then he realizes Andante came here intentionally, knowing no one dares follow Chris. Chris remarks that it is quiet here. Andante smiles and says it always is when the professor is around, then adds that the girls will give up once they know they have no chance. Chris remembers the serif crest and thinks that even as an illegitimate child, Andante is still the Duke's son, an easy route into the serif family's influence. Looking away, Andante says his father barely acknowledges him. Then Andante bows and says he told his father that Chris saved his sister, thanking him deeply and saying he cannot express his gratitude enough. Chris hums, calls him Andante Serif, and points out that he did not use stealth magic even while being chased. Andante falters, and Chris wonders if he no longer wants to hide. Chris snorts and says it does not matter, telling him to enjoy being Andante as much as he likes, privately thinking the boy has always held himself in high regard. Andante blushes, then smirks and asks if the professor would mind him coming here now and then. Chris looks at the sky and says that Andante is starting to annoy him and orders him to leave. Time passes. As the first vacation approaches, the academy and the system settle into uneasy quiet. Then disaster erupts. Lightning tears across the sky, thunder shakes the towers, and a scream echoes through the halls. Students murmur in fear. On a dim stage, a sword drips fresh blood. Chris stares at his hands and thinks that he always imagined using a sword against terrifying enemies, never against a human. Looking at the fallen body, at the spreading red, he acknowledges the truth. His mistake killed someone he knows.